In this video, we're breaking down 2 hours of life-changing Rick and Morty lessons to fall asleep to. First up we got Sacrifice for Family, The Wedding Squanchers. Rick Sanchez spent decades avoiding emotional attachments and keeping everyone at arm's length, but in one single moment, at the end of Season 2, he made a choice that revealed everything about who he really was underneath all the cynicism and alcohol. He turned himself in to the Galactic Federation, the same organization that had been hunting him for years, just so his family could go back to living normal lives on Earth. This wasn't some grand heroic gesture with speeches and tears. It was quiet, calculated, and done completely alone, while his family thought he was just getting ice cream. The whole situation started at breakfast when the Smith family was sitting around the table eating cereal together. Jerry made some comment about keeping 70% of cereal above the milk, and Beth immediately told him to get a job. Rick took a shot at Jerry too, pointing out that he was the man of the house without employment. Then a courier flap showed up at the door, which Rick explained was like the intergalactic version of UPS but less off-putting. The device delivered an invitation to Bird Person's wedding on planet Squanch. Rick cracked open the egg-shaped invitation and a hologram popped out, showing Bird Person and Tammy announcing their mate-melding ceremony. Rick was disgusted and threw the whole thing in the trash, saying weddings were basically funerals with cake, and that if he wanted to watch someone throw their life away, he would hang out with Jerry all day. Beth stopped him and pointed out that having a friend get married was a big deal. Jerry scoffed that it was a big deal. Rick even had a friend. When Rick asked what Jerry knew about friendship, the courier flap misunderstood and confirmed it was shipping Jerry. The machine grabbed Jerry and stuffed him completely inside before flying off into the sky. Beth ran to the door asking where it was taking him, and Rick casually said it was probably taking him to planet Squanch, 6,000 light years across the galaxy. Morty called it insane, and Rick agreed, saying now they had to go to the wedding. This moment is important because Rick didn't want to go at all. He had zero interest in attending this wedding. But the second Jerry got accidentally shipped across the galaxy, Rick immediately decided they were going. He didn't even hesitate or suggest leaving Jerry there. The family flew through space to planet Squanch and met up with Squanchy, one of Rick's old friends. They attended the wedding reception, where Rick gave a speech as the best man. He talked about how Bird Person had been giving him horrible advice for years, telling him that love was a chemical reaction that compelled animals to breed and that it hit hard, then slowly faded, leaving you stranded in a failing marriage. Rick said he ignored this advice because it was completely idiotic. Then he said that Bird Person was his best friend, and if Bird Person loved Tammy, then Rick loved Tammy too. He toasted to friendship, to love, and to his greatest adventure yet, which was opening himself up to others. Everyone clapped and cheered. Squanchy even threw away a collar that said Rick's best friends forever because he was disgusted by the emotional speech. Right after Rick's speech, Tammy stood up to give her own toast. She thanked Rick and said it was beautiful. Then she started talking about how she was a high school senior from Earth marrying a 40-year-old bird person. The guests chuckled at this. Summer cheered her on. Then Tammy said that in a lot of ways, she wasn't really a high school senior from planet Earth. In a lot of ways, what she really was a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation. She revealed that everyone at the wedding was a wanted criminal and the entire building was surrounded. Morty and Summer were confused. Rick immediately said, "Oh shit." Beth didn't get the metaphor, and Jerry said he would explain it later. Tammy announced everyone was under arrest for crimes against the Federation and pulled out a pulse rifle from the large nest. Bird Person stood up and asked Tammy what she was doing. She told him to sit his bird ass down. When he said her name again in confusion, she opened fire and shot him multiple times, killing him. Bird Person fell from the nest, making cawing sounds as he died. Rick screamed his name in horror. The wedding immediately turned into a war zone. Squanchy and several other guests, who turned out to be wanted criminals, pulled out weapons and started fighting back. Squanchy roared and attacked the Gromflemite agents, yelling about giving them a taste of his squanch. Rick told his family to follow him and they all ran. Jerry grabbed a weapon as they escaped. The family spent weeks running and hiding on different planets, living in terrible conditions. They were constantly moving, constantly afraid, and completely unable to return to their normal lives on Earth. The Galactic Federation wanted Rick, and as long as Rick was with them, they would always be hunted and questioned if caught. Eventually, the family ended up on a barren planet called Dwarf Terrace 9, living in a small crashed ship. Jerry couldn't take it anymore and started complaining about their situation. He said they kept acting like there were only two options, but there weren't. He pointed out that if they went back to Earth as long as Rick was out there, the Federation would want to interrogate them. Then he suggested something that shocked everyone. He asked, purely hypothetically, what if they turned Rick in to the government? Beth immediately threatened him, saying if he ever brought that up again, there would be no more bacon. Jerry fired back that there already was no more bacon and that their world sucked. He asked why they were doing all this for someone who would never do anything for anyone but himself. Morty defended Rick, saying that wasn't the point and that they loved Rick, for the most part anyway. Summer jumped in and said you don't love people in hopes of a reward, you love them unconditionally. Beth said she was proud of her kids. Jerry pressed the issue, asking if for the rest of their lives, no matter how much it hurt them, no matter how much it destroyed their children's futures, they were going to do whatever Rick wanted whenever he wants. Everyone except Jerry said yes in unison. Jerry shouted, asking why. Beth finally broke down and screamed that she didn't want Rick to leave again. This was the real answer, the honest truth that had been driving everything. Beth had abandonment issues from her father leaving when she was young, and she was terrified of losing him again. Rick came into the room and said he was going to hop over to the Gloppy Drop system to get some ice cream. Morty asked if Rick wanted him to come along, asking if Rick needed his brainwaves for camouflage. Rick said he would be okay and said goodbye. Morty asked if Rick was leaving. Rick said yeah, he was leaving to get ice cream. Morty asked if he was coming back. Rick explained that if you go to where there's a bunch of ice cream and then don't come back, you haven't actually gotten ice cream, you've just gone where ice cream is. Morty told Rick that he could handle it if Rick left, but that it would break their mom's heart and Morty wouldn't forgive him for that. Rick asked where the van was, and Morty told him it was over the horizon in the driveway. Rick flew through space alone and dialed a number on his phone. An automated system answered in an unintelligible alien language, then offered English as option 2. Rick pressed the button and was connected to an agent. A female voice answered, saying ongoing investigations. Rick said his name was Jerry Smith from planet Earth and that he knew the whereabouts of Rick Sanchez, the wanted criminal. The operator told him to hold on and transferred him. Special Agent Gribbles answered saying he had a tip about Rick Sanchez. Rick confirmed it, pretending to be Jerry, and said that Rick had kidnapped him and his family and left them on Dwarf Terrace 9. He said Rick told him he was going to the Plim Plom Tavern. Rick then asked, still pretending to be Jerry, if his family could have a normal life back on Earth if he was doing the right thing by calling. Agent Gribbles confirmed they only wanted Sanchez and that the family would be fine. Rick thanked him, then added that he was Jerry Smith and loved doing disgusting things. The agent just said okay, confused. Rick flew to the planet where the Plim Plom Tavern was located while the song Hurt by 9 Inch Nails played in the background. Inside the tavern, Rick sat alone drinking and looking at a picture of himself with his friends at the club. He knew his friends were gone now. Bird Person was dead, and Squanchy was who knows where. Rick stood up, dropped the picture on the floor, placed some money on the table, and walked outside. The moment he stepped out, Gromflemite soldiers were waiting and surrounding him. Rick put his hands up and surrendered without a fight. He let them arrest him without any resistance whatsoever. Back on Dwarf Terrace 9, Beth realized Rick wasn't coming back. Morty confirmed it. Then Galactic Federation ships arrived and landed on the surface. Jerry got excited seeing cops. A Gromflemite officer greeted them with good morning. Jerry was happy they were going back to Earth while everyone else was sad because Rick never returned. At a Federation checkpoint back on Earth, a receptionist asked how long they would be visiting Earth. Jerry said they lived there and were just off planet for a wedding. The receptionist pointed them in a direction. Officers held each family member and pulled their tongues out, applying serum for DNA collection that went into classified data files. The family walked outside into their new reality. Earth was now completely under Galactic Federation control. Everything had changed. A robot approached Jerry, scanned him, and said it had processed that Jerry was in distress. The robot prescribed antidepressants compliments of the Galactic Federation. Jerry took the pills immediately and said he felt better. The robot informed him his debt was 7,000 Fed credits and told him to report to the Ministry of Employment, where he would be assigned a function. Jerry got excited and yelled to Beth that he got a job, picking her up in celebration. This was Jerry's dream come true in the worst possible way. He finally had employment and structure, but it came at the cost of Earth's freedom and Rick's imprisonment. Meanwhile, Rick was being processed at the Galactic Federation prison. A photography cyborg took his mugshot, apologizing that it wasn't staring at him. Rick was put in an inmate suit and taken for processing. Officers pulled his tongue and applied serum for DNA collection, marking everything he had been committed for. They watched his extensive criminal record. Rick was then placed in a cube-like cell that floated through the air, incarcerating him in a maximum security room. He was placed next to a Splorpian inmate and a Xerillian inmate. The Xerillian prisoner asked what Rick was in for. Rick simply responded with everything. The sacrifice Rick made was enormous and complicated. He gave up his freedom, his adventures, his entire life of traveling the infinite universe, all so that his family could go home. He heard Beth say she didn't want him to leave again, and he understood that his presence in their lives was destroying them. As long as he was with them, they would be hunted, they would live in fear, and they would never have normal lives. Jerry was right about one thing: their situation was unsustainable. But Jerry's solution of betraying Rick together was never going to happen because the family genuinely loved Rick despite everything. Rick made the choice alone because that's who he is. He didn't discuss it, didn't ask for input, didn't make it into some dramatic moment where everyone could talk about feelings. He just did what needed to be done. He pretended to be Jerry, calling in the tip because he knew the Federation would never suspect Rick of turning himself in. It was the perfect plan because it was so unexpected. Rick could have kept running forever. He had the intelligence and resources to stay ahead of the Federation indefinitely. But he couldn't watch his family suffer anymore, especially Beth. He couldn't be the reason his daughter relived her childhood abandonment trauma over and over again while living in crashed ships on dead planets. The lesson here cuts deep because it shows that sacrifice for family isn't always about dramatic gestures or heroic moments. Sometimes it's about recognizing when your presence in someone's life is causing more harm than good, even when they don't want you to leave. Rick understood that Beth's plea for him to stay was coming from a place of trauma and fear, not from a realistic assessment of their situation. He understood that Morty threatening not to forgive him was actually Morty trying to protect his mother's feelings. Rick saw through all of it to the core truth, which was that his family would never be okay as long as he was with them and the Federation was hunting him. What makes this sacrifice even more powerful is that Rick got absolutely nothing out of it except the knowledge that his family was safe. He didn't get to see them settled back on Earth. He didn't get thanks or recognition. He didn't even get to say a proper goodbye. He just made the call, went to the bar, looked at the picture of his dead friend, and walked outside to be arrested. The song Hurt playing during this sequence wasn't accidental. The lyrics talk about everyone going away in the end, about hurting yourself to see if you still feel, about building an empire of dirt. Rick had built this empire of interdimensional adventures and infinite possibilities, and in the end, it all came down to dirt. His best friend was dead. His other friend was scattered who knows where. His family was suffering, and the only way to fix any of it was to give up everything. The contrast between Rick at the wedding, giving that speech about opening himself up to others, and Rick in prison saying he was in for everything, shows the complete arc. He tried to be vulnerable, tried to believe in friendship and love, and it immediately blew up in his face with Bird Person's murder and his family's suffering. But instead of proving his cynical worldview correct, instead of saying, "See, this is why I never open up," Rick made the most emotionally open choice possible. He sacrificed his freedom for people who couldn't even survive in space without him. That's not logic, that's not calculation, that's pure love, even if Rick would never call it that. Beth's line about not wanting him to leave again reveals everything about their relationship and why Rick made this choice. She wasn't worried about practical things like safety or resources. She was worried about abandonment. She was worried about being that little girl again, whose dad disappeared into the garage and never came out. Rick knew that feeling because he caused it. He knew that every day they spent on the run, every uncomfortable night in a crashed ship, every moment of fear and uncertainty was just another way of leaving her. So he chose a different kind of leaving, one where he actually stayed gone, but where Beth could live a normal life and eventually maybe heal from the abandonment instead of reliving it constantly. The fact that Jerry ended up happy with his assigned job and prescribed medication while the rest of the family was clearly miserable shows how little Jerry understood about what happened. He thought they won. He thought going back to Earth under Federation control with Rick in prison was a victory. He got structure and employment and mind-altering drugs to make him compliant. Meanwhile, Beth, Summer, and Morty had to live knowing that Rick sacrificed everything for them and they couldn't do anything to help him. They had to live in a conquered world knowing that their freedom came at the cost of Rick's imprisonment. Rick sitting in that maximum security cell next to other prisoners, responding that he was in for everything, was him accepting the weight of his choices. Not just his recent choice to turn himself in, but every choice he'd ever made that led to this moment. Every adventure, every crime, every time he put his family in danger, every friend he'd lost, all of it compressed into that one word, everything. He wasn't making excuses or trying to minimize it. He owned all of it, and he was willing to pay the price if it meant his family could go home. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the lesson everyone avoids until it hits them. Therapy works, avoidance fails. Pickle Rick. Rick Sanchez once turned himself into a pickle just to avoid going to family therapy, and what happened next revealed one of the most important lessons about how smart people often use their intelligence as an excuse to avoid dealing with their emotional problems. The whole situation started on a morning when the family had an appointment for counseling that was set a week ago and agreed upon by everyone, including Rick. But when Beth reminded everyone they needed to get going, Rick was already a pickle on his workbench in the garage, claiming it was an experiment he did to challenge himself. Morty immediately saw through it and asked if Rick did this on purpose to get out of family counseling. Beth told Morty to stop, but Rick assured them he would never find a way to get out of family therapy, hoping his lack of fingers didn't prevent the perception of his air quotes. Summer asked why he couldn't just turn himself back into a human. Rick explained he did this to challenge himself, and it could take hours or even days before he could figure out how to return to human form. But he suggested Beth could put him in a purse or pocket if she really needed him to go. Beth said nobody needed anything, and that Rick should just stay home and figure out how to stop being a pickle. Then Morty noticed something suspicious. He pointed out that there was a syringe of mysterious fluid hanging directly over Rick. He also noticed the string attached to it ran through a pair of scissors attached to a timer. And the timer was set to go off in exactly 10 minutes, which was exactly when they would have left for therapy. Rick tried to dismiss this, saying the syringe was completely unrelated to the discussion and didn't warrant further explanation. Beth wasn't buying it. She cut down the syringe and took it with her, saying Rick wouldn't want to get pierced by a needle full of liquid unrelated to his situation. Rick couldn't argue with that logic. Beth told him they would see him later, and drove away with Summer and Morty. Rick realized he might have messed up. A cat named Izzy came into the garage and knocked Rick off his workbench, causing him to roll down the driveway. Rick was facing directly up at the bright sun and started sweating and shriveling up in the heat. He commented that this couldn't really be the way he went out, calling it the mega genius equivalent of dying on the toilet. Just as Rick was about to die from dehydration, it started raining. Rick was relieved at first, but then the rain got too heavy and started flooding. He rolled down the road and fell through a sewer grate into the sewer system below. Rick landed in the sewers and immediately started working to survive. He bit his lip to release pickle juice, which attracted a cockroach. When the bug got close enough, Rick bit its head and squeezed it until the bug died. He licked off the top of the bug's head to reveal its brain, then licked part of the brain which made the bug's leg move. Rick rolled onto the bug and used its brain to control its legs, moving himself forward. He had successfully created a way to move around as a pickle using bug parts. Meanwhile, the family arrived at Dr. Wong's therapy office. Summer complained that it wasn't even family therapy if their dad wasn't invited and Grandpa wouldn't come. Morty asked what was courageous about eating a hot dog, referring to a motivational poster in the waiting room. Beth explained that nobody chose to be there, that the family was told to get counseling by Morty's principal, even though it wasn't the family that was huffing pottery glaze in the art room and desk wedding in history class. They waited until Dr. Wong called them in. Dr. Wong asked if there was a grandpa who might be joining them. Beth started to explain that Rick got wrapped up in an experiment because he was a scientist on an intergalactic sci-fi level. Morty interrupted and simply said Rick turned himself into a pickle. Dr. Wong asked if Grandpa turned himself into a pickle a lot. Beth got defensive and asked what kind of question that was. Dr. Wong calmly explained it was the kind of question that wasn't designed to attack or hurt Beth in any way. Beth said her father had never turned himself into a pickle before, that he was just unpredictable and eccentric. Dr. Wong opened things up to the whole family and asked why they thought Grandpa turned himself into a pickle. Beth rolled her eyes at the question. Back in the sewers, Rick had built an exoskeleton using rat parts after killing several rats through elaborate traps and direct combat. He created weapons from office supplies and rat body parts, turning himself into a functioning combat unit. A large group of rats attacked him, but Rick fought them off using makeshift weapons attached to his pickle body. Back at therapy, the conversation got more intense. Summer pointed out that what was important was that Grandpa lied to Beth to get out of coming to therapy. Beth insisted he did not lie. Dr. Wong suggested doing an experiment since this family valued science. She asked everyone to raise their hand if they felt certain they knew what was in the syringe. Nobody raised their hand. Then she asked everyone to raise their hand if they knew for certain the syringe did not contain anti-pickle serum. Beth started to raise her hand but stopped herself. Dr. Wong noticed and pointed out that Beth's hand did a little thing there. Beth got defensive and accused Dr. Wong of having a racist name. She said that Morty and Summer were seizing on this arbitrary pickle obsession as a way to avoid what was supposed to be their therapy. Dr. Wong disagreed and said she thought this pickle incident was a better path than any other to the heart of the family's dysfunction. She explained that she thought it was possible that Beth and her father had a very specific dynamic, one that didn't reward emotion or vulnerability and might even punish them. She suggested this dynamic might have eroded Beth's marriage and was infecting the kids with a tendency to misdirect their feelings. Beth responded by telling Dr. Wong to fuck off, then told her kids to fuck off too when they protested. Rick continued his adventures as Pickle Rick. He ended up in some kind of government building where armed guards tried to kill him. He navigated through air ducts and mail tubes, gathering office supplies to build weapons. He killed multiple armed guards using improvised weapons and traps. The agency director called in a prisoner named Jaguar, offering him freedom if he would kill the pickle. Jaguar agreed after being told his daughter was alive and could be freed too. Rick and Jaguar fought each other in an intense battle. Both were injured, but Rick eventually won. However, he didn't kill Jaguar. Instead, they teamed up after Rick realized the agency director had lied to Jaguar about his daughter being alive. Rick and Jaguar escaped together in a helicopter. Jaguar told Rick that it was too late for him to tell his daughter he loved her, but not too late for Rick. Rick dismissed this, saying his daughter already knew and that they didn't really buy into that kind of thing. He explained that, to the extent love was an expression of familiarity over time, his access to infinite timelines prevented the necessity of attachment. He even mentioned that he had abandoned one of his infinite daughters in an alternate version of Earth that was taken over by mutants. Jaguar just said okay and wished Rick good luck with that attitude. Back at therapy, Beth admitted she was afraid her kids would get expelled. Dr. Wong said that was good. Summer shared that she was mad that she couldn't huff enamel without people assuming it was because her family sucked, and that she hoped to be seen one day as someone who just liked getting high. Morty said he was sad that he peed in class instead of a toilet. Dr. Wong praised them and suggested they do this once a week. That's when the door burst open and Pickle Rick walked in, flopping down on the couch next to Summer. Dr. Wong introduced herself and told Rick that his family was crazy about him and his daughter held him in very high regard. Rick asked Beth if she still had that syringe in her purse. Beth looked at Dr. Wong, who nodded for her to proceed. Beth asked Rick to tell her what was in the syringe. Rick admitted it was a serum he needed to stay alive. He explained he had a rough day, sustained a lot of damage, and was pretty close to death, which the serum would prevent. Dr. Wong clarified that it would change him from a pickle to a human. Rick confirmed this was true. Dr. Wong asked Rick why he lied to his daughter. Rick said it was so he wouldn't have to come to therapy. Dr. Wong asked why he didn't want to come. Rick explained that he didn't respect therapy because he was a scientist. He said that because he invented, transformed, created, and destroyed for a living, when he didn't like something about the world, he just changed it. He didn't think going to a rented office in a strip mall to listen to some agent of averageness explain which words meant which feelings had ever helped anyone do anything. He thought it helped a lot of people get comfortable and stop panicking, which was a state of mind valued in animals we eat, but not something he wanted for himself. He wasn't a cow. He was a pickle when he felt like it. Then Dr. Wong delivered the most important part of the entire session. She told Rick that the only connection between his unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying his family was that everyone in his family, including Rick, used intelligence to justify sickness. She said he seemed to alternate between viewing his own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. She thought it was because the only truly unapproachable concept for him was that his mind was within his control. He chose to come there. He chose to talk and belittle her vocation, just as he chose to become a pickle. He was the master of his universe, and yet he was dripping with rat blood and feces. His enormous mind was literally vegetating by his own hand. Dr. Wong continued by saying she had no doubt Rick would be bored senseless by therapy, the same way she was bored when she brushed her teeth and wiped her ass. Because the thing about repairing, maintaining, and cleaning was that it wasn't an adventure. There was no way to do it so wrong you might die. It was just work. And the bottom line was that some people were okay going to work, and some people would rather die. Each person got to choose. The session ended, and Dr. Wong gave them her card, hoping to hear from them again. In the car ride home, Rick apologized for lying to get out of the thing and said he shouldn't lie to Beth. Beth said it was fine and thanked him, agreeing he shouldn't lie, but hoping he knew that wasn't what the session was supposed to be about. Rick said he knew it was about Morty peeing his pants and Summer snorting glue. Beth laughed and corrected him that Summer huffed enamel, and they never even talked about it because there was so much more at stake. Rick called the therapist a monologuist. Summer asked if they were going to go back. Rick asked for the syringe instead of answering. Beth gave Rick the syringe and apologized, saying he must be in agony. Rick just said and injected himself, transforming back into a human while coughing up pickle brine. He immediately complained about therapists. Beth agreed they were a weird breed. Rick said he missed having hands and blood and a stomach, then suggested they should get a drink. Beth got excited and asked if he meant go somewhere. Rick said yes, they should drop the kids off and go tie one on. Beth was thrilled. Morty quietly said he liked Dr. Wong. Beth asked Rick if he was thinking Smokey's Tavern or Shoney's. Rick said either one would be fine. The lesson here is about how people use their intelligence and abilities to avoid doing uncomfortable emotional work. Rick literally went through an entire action movie adventure fighting rats and armed government agents rather than sit in a room for an hour and talk about his feelings. He nearly died multiple times as a pickle in the sewers, got shot at, built weapons from garbage and dead animals, killed dozens of people, and went through absolute hell, all because that was somehow easier for him than admitting he had problems and needed help. Dr. Wong's point was that Rick kept using his genius intellect to justify avoiding the basic maintenance work of relationships and mental health. He could invent anything, travel anywhere, do impossible things, but he couldn't sit still and do the boring work of actually dealing with his emotions and his family's problems. And the really sad part was that his whole family had learned this behavior from him. They all used their intelligence to justify their dysfunction. They all avoided dealing with real problems by making them complicated or turning them into something else. The most powerful part of the lesson was when Dr. Wong explained that maintenance work isn't an adventure, brushing your teeth isn't exciting, wiping yourself isn't thrilling, going to therapy isn't a hero's journey. These things are just work, boring, necessary work that keeps you healthy and functional. But some people would rather die than do boring work. They need everything to be an adventure or a challenge or something interesting. They can't just sit with uncomfortable feelings and process them like regular people. Rick proved Dr. Wong's point perfectly by suggesting he and Beth get drinks right after therapy, instead of actually discussing what happened or making any plans to address their issues. He apologized for lying, but immediately pivoted to avoiding the deeper conversation. Beth went along with it because she had the same avoidance patterns. They were both so uncomfortable with vulnerability and emotional honesty that they would rather get drunk together than have a real conversation about their relationship or their family's problems. The ending showed that nothing really changed. Rick learned nothing. Beth learned nothing. They heard everything Dr. Wong said and understood it intellectually, but they chose to ignore it and go back to their old patterns. Morty was the only one who admitted he liked Dr. Wong, showing he was actually open to getting help. But he was a kid and had no power to make the family go back. The adults were in charge, and the adults chose avoidance over growth. This lesson applies to so many people in real life. Smart people especially fall into this trap. They use their intelligence to justify why they don't need therapy, why their problems are too complex for simple solutions, why traditional approaches won't work for them. They create elaborate explanations for why they're different and special and above the normal rules of mental health, but really, they're just scared. They're scared of being vulnerable, scared of admitting they need help, scared of doing the boring, unsexy work of actually healing. The pickle was a perfect metaphor. Rick transformed himself into something completely different to avoid being himself in an uncomfortable situation. He made himself literally unable to participate in therapy. And when that backfired and he almost died, he went through hell rather than just asking his family for help or admitting he made a mistake. His pride and his need to be in control and his fear of vulnerability nearly killed him multiple times. But he still thought it was worth it because at least he wasn't sitting in therapy talking about his feelings. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to a lesson Rick and Morty makes painfully clear. Consent is non-negotiable, autoerotic assimilation. Rick Sanchez once reunited with an ex who literally controlled entire planets worth of people by absorbing their minds and taking over their bodies. And what happened over that weekend revealed one of the most important lessons about toxic relationships and why consent is absolutely non-negotiable in every situation. The episode started with Rick, Morty, and Summer flying through space singing together when a distress beacon went off. Rick got excited and explained that the first rule of space travel was to always check out distress beacons because 9 out of 10 times it was a ship full of dead aliens and a bunch of free stuff. 1 out of 10 times it was a deadly trap, but Rick was ready to roll those dice. They arrived at a ship called the SS Independence and started exploring the corridors. Summer commented that it seemed like something terrible happened there. Rick agreed, but was more focused on potential loot, telling them that if they found a room full of eggs, they should give one a shake because facehuggers were worth more than the whole ship. Rick started spray painting a symbol on a closed door. When Morty asked what he was doing, Rick explained he was making the cops write it up as a looting by the core blocks. Summer said that was horrible. Rick responded that he heard her and agreed that cops were racist, completely missing her actual point. Then a door opened behind them with 6 crew members. Rick immediately pretended to be relieved they were alive. A female alien asked if they could help, explaining that their planet was taken over by some kind of entity that absorbed the minds of their people. A male alien added that they didn't notice until it was too late, that the people it took over looked like their friends, family, and leaders, but they weren't themselves anymore because they were part of it. Rick asked how they knew it didn't get on the ship with them, pointing out that 2 of the aliens seemed pretty calm about the whole thing. The 2 calm aliens immediately screeched, and the other 4 got assimilated right in front of them. Morty screamed. Rick said he called it. All 6 aliens spoke together in unison, saying hello to Rick and that it had been a long time. Rick recognized the voice and said Unity's name in shock. Morty and Summer both asked who Unity was. Rick explained that Unity was an entity he used to date. This was the first major red flag in the entire situation. Unity was a hive mind that controlled people by absorbing their consciousness and taking over their bodies completely. These people had no choice, no agency, no ability to consent to what was happening to them. Unity just took them over and used their bodies however it wanted. The family landed on Unity's planet, where Unity had taken over the entire population. Unity spoke through different bodies, explaining that after breaking up with Rick, it spent some time wandering through space, then found this world where it was better able to focus on its passion for unification. Summer immediately called it out, asking if Unity meant stealing people's bodies. Rick told Summer she was being rude and suggested the kids run off and play with Unity while Rick and Unity did some catching up. Morty was worried they were going to get barfed into and absorbed. Unity assured them through an administrator's body that they were guests and free to be themselves, saying Unity had never been good at disappointing Rick. This moment was crucial because it showed that Unity gave Rick's family consent to remain themselves, but only because Rick wanted it that way. Everyone else on the planet had no such choice. They didn't get to opt out of being controlled. Unity just took them over without asking. The entity could respect consent for people Rick cared about, but violated everyone else's autonomy without a second thought. This double standard revealed how conditional and situational Unity's respect for individual agency really was. Rick and Unity started reconnecting. Unity showed Rick that world peace had been achieved, though Rick found it weird that Unity published a paper about it for itself. Unity explained through different bodies on the street that after becoming a Type 1 civilization, the world would be invited into the Galactic Federation, and from there, Unity would have access to countless planets and species. One by one, Unity would unify them and become the universe, becoming what single-minded people once called a god. Rick found this sexy. When he asked where he could get a drink, Unity explained through an old woman's body that recreational substances were phased out because there was no need for escape from the self when your world was one. Rick called Unity out on this, reminding the entity that he once watched Unity assimilate a whole police station just to get hands on the evidence locker. Unity admitted through a worker's body that when they met, Unity was a young hive mind with the population of a small town, and that people change, especially when Unity changes them. Unity apologized for disappointing Rick, but said it had grown. Rick claimed he had grown too, that he reconnected with his family. Unity asked through a police officer's body why that was. Rick suggested maybe it was part of getting old, or maybe he just missed being with a collective. They started kissing while a crowd of Unity-controlled people formed around them and cheered. Rick stopped and said, "Not like this," then listed his demands, including a hang glider, a crotchless Uncle Sam costume, an entire stadium field covered with naked redheads, and stands packed with men who resembled his father. This scene showed how Rick and Unity's relationship was built entirely on Rick's desires and Unity's willingness to violate consent to fulfill them. Unity controlled thousands of people, forcing them to participate in Rick's sexual fantasies without any of those people having a say in the matter. These were real individuals with their own lives, families, and dreams, and Unity just hijacked their bodies to please Rick. The redheads Unity mentioned were in a hurry to be somewhere else, suggesting that even under Unity's control, some part of them was resisting or uncomfortable with what was happening. Meanwhile, Morty and Summer were watching assimilated people build a Mount Rushmore-style monument of their heads while eating burgers. Morty was impressed by how coordinated everyone was. Summer tried to make him see that these poor people's bodies were being used and that they were a planet of puppets. Unity could hear them and responded through a fan holder. Summer got disgusted. They asked to be taken back to Rick, but Unity said through a clown that now wasn't a good time, clearly because Rick and Unity were in the middle of their elaborate sexual scenario. Back on Earth, Jerry found a secret hatch in Rick's garage that led to an underground lair. He and Beth discovered an alien named Blim Blam chained up down there. Jerry was thrilled to have caught Rick in something clearly wrong. Beth tried to defend Rick, suggesting maybe the creature was dangerous and Rick chained it up to protect everyone. Jerry argued that Rick was probably harvesting the creature's organs. Beth countered that Rick was probably trying to cure its space aids. They kept arguing over Rick's motivations, while completely ignoring the chained-up alien between them. On Unity's planet, Rick was getting drunk and high with Unity, while the hive mind started losing control. Beta 7, a neighboring hive mind species, showed up for a practical alliance meeting. Rick made an inappropriate joke and put his hand on Beta 7's shoulder, causing all of Beta 7's assimilated people to scream and point at Rick. Unity defended Rick, suggesting that if Unity's allies were a problem for Beta 7, maybe their alliance was a problem too. Beta 7 backed down. Rick noticed Unity had access to powdered neutronium and amphetatron, ingredients for making drugs. Unity hesitated but agreed to use them, saying what the hell, they could purify the resin and make fractal dust. Rick suggested making velocities instead. Unity asked if Old Man Rick couldn't party with the whole planet. Rick said he could do whatever Unity did and more. The substance abuse escalated, and Unity began losing control over the assimilated population. People started remembering who they were and regaining their individual consciousness. This should have been a good thing, a liberation from the violation of having their bodies controlled. But the first thing that happened when people got their minds back was a race war breaking out between people with different nipple configurations. Ron Benson, who had flat concentric nipple rings, declared his race superior. Daryl Jefferson, who had cone nipples, disagreed violently. They started fighting and the whole area broke out into chaos. Summer tried to stop them, asking why they were fighting when they couldn't see they were all the same. Morty commented that this was Summer's first race war. She insisted she didn't start it, that they were the racists, and she merely empowered them to follow their apparently misguided dreams. The crowd turned on Summer and Morty for having regular nipples and no race. The two got chased and cornered before Unity regained enough control to send SWAT teams to rescue them. Unity admitted to Summer and Morty through a pilot that Unity was having fun with their grandpa and lost a little control. Unity was probably not fit to be piloting a hovercopter or running 200,000 pediatric hospitals and 12 million deep fryers, but hey, the planet couldn't take its business elsewhere. Morty suggested maybe they should stop and get Unity a coffee or splash water on Unity's face. Unity said no. If Unity wanted to be sober, Unity wouldn't have gotten drunk. This moment perfectly illustrated how Unity's substance abuse wasn't just affecting Unity, but literally millions of people who had no choice in the matter. When Unity got drunk and high, all those controlled people suffered the consequences. Hospitals weren't being run properly, children were at risk, infrastructure was failing, and none of those people consented to being put in danger because an alien hive mind wanted to party with its ex-boyfriend. The violation of consent extended beyond just controlling their bodies, to also endangering their lives through negligence. Summer and Morty confronted Rick at Unity's house, which was on fire and a complete mess. Unity said through an administrator that the cleaning lady part of Unity was coming on Friday, then realized Unity had a Galactic Federation meeting in an hour. Summer demanded Rick come out. He stumbled out wearing ridiculous clothes and clearly very intoxicated. Summer said they needed to go home. Rick opened a portal and said, "See ya." Morty said they all needed to go. Rick told them to tend their garden because he was doing a thing. Summer said they weren't leaving without him. Rick dismissed their concerns, saying the kids were just afraid the big bad hive mind was going to steal their grandpa away. Summer corrected him, saying actually she thought Unity was great and Rick was a horrible influence on it. This surprised Rick. Morty agreed, saying this wasn't healthy and Rick was really up to no good. Summer compared Rick and Unity to leggings and mid-calf boots, two things that think they're great together but just bring out the worst in each other. Rick dismissed this and asked what Unity thought. Unity said through someone that Unity was just taking a break and needed to relax. Rick turned up the news, which was entirely Unity-controlled people saying everything looked worse than it was and they were just having a good time. Summer tried one last approach, asking Rick to come with them as a favor because he loved them. Rick called this dumb and said bye. When Morty tried to continue, Rick cut him off and called Summer a hyper-emotional, needy little human, saying it ran in the family. He said he could tolerate it but couldn't give a crap about it, and told them to take a hike. Summer told Unity to take care of itself and left with Morty through the portal. Rick immediately asked Unity if Unity could assimilate a giraffe, showing his complete lack of reflection on what just happened. Rick and Unity continued partying. Rick had Unity create an entire TV show just for him, telling Unity to make characters cry happy tears, make fun of the blonde one, make them do it on the table. He told Unity to cancel the show, then put it back on, then said he was bored. Unity tried to bring up calling Summer and Morty because Unity felt bad. Rick dismissed this, saying, "Screw those guys." He went to the bathroom and when he came back, Unity was gone. The entire town was covered in notes. Rick picked one up and read it. Unity's letter explained that Unity was doing this in notes because Unity wasn't strong enough to do it in person. Unity realized it was attracted to Rick for the same reason it couldn't be with him, because Rick couldn't change, and Unity had no problem with that. But it clearly meant Unity had a problem with itself. Unity was sure there was no perfect version of itself, and that Unity would just unify species after species and never be complete. But Unity knew how it went with them. Unity would lose who Unity was and become part of Rick. Because, in a strange way, Rick was better at what Unity did without even trying. The letter was signed yours and nobody else's, Unity. This breakup letter revealed the core truth about their relationship. Unity was an entity that controlled others, but with Rick, Unity was the one being controlled. Unity lost its own identity and agency when with Rick. Unity became what Rick wanted instead of what Unity wanted to be. The relationship was toxic because it was built on mutual destruction. Rick brought out Unity's worst impulses, encouraging substance abuse and reckless behavior that endangered millions. Unity brought out Rick's worst impulses, enabling his narcissism and giving him unlimited power over unwilling participants in his fantasies. Rick came home and Beth confronted him about the alien prisoner in the underground lair. She admitted the alien got away and said no more alien prisoners and no more subterranean excavation without consulting the family. Rick just said okay. Beth was shocked and asked if he was going to quietly teleport somewhere and never come back. Rick said no, it was her house. Summer asked what happened with Unity. Rick pretended not to care, saying Unity was an entity that thrived on enslavement and it wasn't cool. That fun was fun, but who needed it? He went to the garage. In the garage, Rick built what appeared to be a suicide device. He drained his flask and threw it away. He pulled out equipment and brought a frozen alien creature to life, stroked it while it shrieked, then disintegrated it with an energy blast. He positioned his own head under the device and activated it. At the last second, he passed out from the alcohol and chemicals in his system, falling forward and dodging the killing blast by accident. He remained slumped unconscious on the desk through the night and into the morning while Jerry happily weeded the garden outside, completely unaware of what almost happened. The lesson here about consent is multi-layered and devastating. On the surface level, Unity violated the consent of millions of people by taking over their bodies and minds without permission. These people had no choice, no voice, no ability to refuse. Unity just took them and used them. And Rick not only accepted this, but actively participated in it, making demands that forced Unity to violate more people's consent to satisfy his desires. Rick knew those people didn't want to be involved in his sexual fantasies, but he didn't care because he wanted what he wanted and Unity would give it to him. On a deeper level, the relationship between Rick and Unity violated both of their own consent in a way. Unity couldn't maintain its identity around Rick and became someone Unity didn't want to be. Unity lost control, endangered the people it was supposed to be unified with, and compromised its own values and goals. Rick, similarly, couldn't maintain healthy boundaries or make good choices around Unity. The relationship brought out destructive impulses in both of them that nearly led to Rick's death. The episode showed that relationships built on power imbalances and boundary violations are fundamentally broken even when both parties seem to want them. Unity and Rick both claimed to consent to their relationship, but their dynamic was so toxic and mutually destructive that true informed consent was impossible. They were enabling each other's worst behaviors, and neither could be their authentic selves together. Unity became reckless and negligent. Rick became suicidal. Most importantly, the millions of people Unity controlled never consented to any of it. They didn't ask to have their minds absorbed. They didn't ask to participate in Rick's fantasies. They didn't ask to be endangered by Unity's substance abuse. They were victims of a massive, ongoing violation of consent that was treated as acceptable because Unity was the one doing it, and Unity was powerful. The episode showed how easily people can rationalize and ignore consent violations when they benefit from them or when the violator is someone they care about. Summer was the only character who consistently called this out. She recognized immediately that what Unity was doing was wrong, that these people's bodies were being stolen. Even when the race war broke out and showed that humans left to their own devices would still do terrible things, that didn't justify Unity's control. The choice between Unity's control and humans' potential for violence was a false choice. The answer wasn't perfect control by a hive mind, but rather addressing the root causes of prejudice and hatred through education, healing, and systemic change that respected people's agency. Rick almost dying at the end was the inevitable conclusion of a relationship built on mutual destruction and disrespect for boundaries. When you violate consent, when you enable toxic behavior, when you lose yourself in someone else, the ending is never good. Unity recognized this and had the strength to leave. Rick didn't have that strength and nearly killed himself as a result. The lesson was clear. Consent is non-negotiable in every situation, for every person, all the time. Without it, relationships become vehicles for harm, no matter how much the participants claim to want them. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to You Are Not Your Toxicity, Rest and Relaxation. Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith once used an alien detoxification machine that literally removed everything they considered toxic about themselves. And what happened next revealed one of the most important lessons about self-acceptance and why you cannot separate yourself from the parts of you that you hate. The episode started 6 days after what was supposed to be a 20-minute adventure. Rick and Morty returned in their space cruiser, completely traumatized and falling apart. They were unkempt, exhausted, and barely escaped with their lives from a massive explosion. When they got back to the garage, they both broke down completely. Morty was crying and screaming that he couldn't do this anymore. Rick admitted it was seriously messed up and they almost died. When Morty asked if Rick agreed it was too much, Rick said yes, that it was insane and pure luck, that he was not in control of that situation at all. Morty kept crying while Rick noticed his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He showed Morty his trembling hands and asked why he kept doing this to them. Rick didn't know, saying maybe he hated himself. Maybe he thought he deserved to die. Then Rick said they needed a vacation. They went to an alien spa that Rick called the best day spa in the galaxy. They got spit out of a giant pink creature onto a comfortable mattress, completely relaxed. Rick explained these creatures just did what they did in the wild, that they loved swallowing stressed out creatures for 20 minutes and then puking them up. Morty said his whole body felt like a baby's behind. They walked down a hallway holding drinks when an alien worker offered them a complimentary psychological detox that removed all cognitive toxins and purified the system. Rick got annoyed and asked if the alien was on commission. Morty asked the alien directly, and the alien said they weren't on commission, they got paid by the hour, so there was no incentive really. The alien kept making gurgling sounds in the back of their throat. Rick lost his temper and told the alien to try swallowing the giant ball of mucus dangling in the back of their throat, that it was disgusting and nobody wanted to hear that. He threw his drink on the ground and got in the alien's face. Morty grabbed Rick and dragged him into the detox room, telling him that was enough. They both sat down in the seats as the doors closed. Rick commented that he really bit that guy's head off and needed to chill. Morty suggested maybe Rick should go through twice. Rick told Morty not to bust his balls and that he wasn't helping things. The machine started shaking and making loud noises. Morty asked if the thing was supposed to be making that noise, but before he could finish, the room exploded with a bright white flash. When the white faded, there was a ringing noise. Rick was laying down in a gross, mucky surface that looked like mud. He was made out of the same gunk. Everything around him was mucky, dark, and disgusting. Toxic Rick lifted his face out of the muck and shouted for Morty. Toxic Morty was almost completely sunk inside the mud and weakly waved his hand. Toxic Rick walked up and forcefully yanked Morty out and back onto his feet. Toxic Morty asked what happened. Toxic Rick yelled at him, calling him an idiot and saying they obviously blew up because the guy Rick yelled at overloaded the machine. He said it takes more than that to kill Rick and Morty. A group of angry, groaning, mucky creatures crawled towards them. Toxic Rick said this might kill them and told Morty to run. Toxic Morty complained that everything hurt. Toxic Rick said that was because Morty was worthless. He stepped on a creature's face and killed it, complaining about how big the explosion was and saying he was a genius who didn't have time for this. They ran into a messy cave and Toxic Rick threw Toxic Morty into it. Toxic Morty got scared and curled into a ball, asking if they were in hell. Toxic Rick pointed at him and yelled that Morty was so stupid and that there was no such thing as hell. Toxic Morty said he believed Rick, but just wanted to die. Toxic Rick said Morty could die when Rick said so, that Rick controlled him and the universe. Then Toxic Rick stopped and stared at Toxic Morty as a piece of his cheek melted off. Toxic Rick realized they weren't in hell, they were in the detoxifier. The machine didn't blow up, it worked normally. It removed their toxins. They were the toxins. Toxic Morty started screaming in terror. Toxic Rick shook him and yelled that they were what got removed. Meanwhile, the scene cut to healthy Rick and Morty walking out of the room. The alien worker hoped they found the detox sufficiently relaxing. Rick apologized for his earlier comments about the alien's throat. The alien said it was all good. Rick said it was nice of the alien to let him off the hook, but that his behavior was still unacceptable and he did regret it. The alien said he'd been working there a long time and understood. Rick and Morty flew back home in their spaceship, both happy and relaxed. Morty asked if he could put on some music. Rick said not at all, meaning yes. Morty hit shuffle and a random song played. They both bobbed their heads to the beat. Rick asked what it was and Morty said he just hit shuffle. Rick couldn't believe it. Morty suggested they should listen to one random song a day because they'd end up hearing more songs they didn't like, but they'd discover a lot more that they did. Rick thought this was an interesting concept and wondered if there was an algorithmic expression that could achieve the ideal ratio. He laughed at himself for trying to calculate happiness. Morty said if anyone could do it, Rick could. Rick said there was something no science could measure, that he was real proud to be Morty's grandpa. Morty thanked Rick and said he loved him. Back with the toxic versions, Toxic Morty was sitting making a pot while Toxic Rick mixed up chemicals. Toxic Rick discovered a new element and bragged about it, asking if Morty thought he could do that, or if anyone could do that ever in a billion years. He asked if God could do it, if God existed. The answer was no, and if God existed, it was Toxic Rick. Toxic Rick discovered the toxic equivalent of electricity while Morty was being parasitic. Toxic Morty said he thought his voice was annoying. Toxic Rick agreed and said it was Morty's best quality. At Harry Herpson High School, Mr. Goldenfold was teaching a math class. He asked who could tell him the common denominator of two fractions. Morty said if they were all bored, wouldn't the common denominator be Mr. Goldenfold himself? All the students laughed. Mr. Goldenfold said it was hilarious, and normally he would come down on any disruption, but it seemed to represent a positive change for Morty's character. He dismissed class early. Students congratulated Morty as they left. Morty walked down the hallway and various students thanked him for advice or told him they accomplished things. A student named Mitch played the trombone for Morty, who told Mitch the music was in his heart the whole time. Morty took a hat off a girl who wished she had the courage to be herself. A bully approached Morty and said Morty might have all these idiots fooled, but the bully knew Morty was still the same pathetic loser hiding behind a confident facade. The bully said he knew that because he was doing the same thing, and now he wasn't alone anymore. Jessica approached Morty and said word around school was that Morty had become super healthy. Morty said he didn't know about all that, but he did know he had a bad case of have taken you to dinner-itis that might be fatal. Rick interrupted and asked for a moment of Morty's time. Outside in the car park, Rick said he hated to bug Morty, but after their morning hike, Rick started receiving very faint, unusual transmissions on his sub-ether phone. He played a recording that sounded distorted with growling and shrieking. Morty suggested it was a bad phone, and Rick should chuck it. Morty had downgraded to a clamshell for emergencies only, saying if something was worth saying, it was worth eye contact. Rick said he traced the source back to the spa and enhanced the audio. The enhanced recording revealed Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty saying they remembered Rick and Morty, that Rick and Morty were garbage, not them, that Toxic Rick was a genius and a god. Rick asked Morty, what if the toxic parts of them had their own identities and will to live? And what if Toxic Rick shared Rick's intelligence and devised a way to reach out? Morty said Toxic Rick sounded like he was in a lot of pain, but Rick shouldn't have to deal with that. Morty suggested urban spin yoga to work off Rick's trauma. Rick said he didn't think he could blow this off. If he had known it worked this way, he wouldn't have detoxed, but he would have because he was toxic. Now he was detoxed and accountable to his toxins. It was a dilemma. Morty said he knew what to do and grabbed Rick's phone and broke it in half. Rick protested, but Morty said Rick's brain just missed eating all those big fat problems. Morty told Rick to focus on the good thing and trust that things were good. Taking that away from Morty wouldn't be healthy. Morty walked away laughing, calling Rick the world's greatest grandpa for real. Morty went on a date with Jessica at a restaurant. He was talking non-stop, saying he loved drums but never took lessons because of limitations, that humans were addicted to their own limitations. He asked if the kale was prepared in the kitchen and ordered water. Jessica tried to order and mispronounced crudité. The waiter corrected her pronunciation. Morty said it was okay to pronounce it however she wanted because words were just things. He told the waiter they were having a conversation. After the waiter left, Morty said he was so excited to finally have dinner with Jessica and wished she would shut up. He said he was kidding, then asked why she was so quiet and what was wrong. He asked her to tell him about herself, what the atmosphere was like on Planet Jessica. Jessica said she liked the restaurant. Morty banged on the table and said they had a moron over here, meaning himself. He told Jessica she had to do the detox thing he did. He described it with sound effects. Jessica said cool, but looked uncomfortable. She grabbed her phone, but it was out of battery. She said she forgot she had a thing. Morty said things were good. Jessica said she was being rude, and the truth was better. She didn't think it would work out. Morty said she had no need to explain, and it was all good. Jessica said she thought Morty would get bored with her and left. Morty said exactly. The sparks weren't flying. That's what dating was for. No damage, no worries. He ate his vegetables alone, then approached a woman at the bar named Stacy. Morty told Stacy her money was no good there and said he'd get the next round. Stacy asked if he wasn't a child. Morty said only in the ways that mattered. He told Stacy he'd been watching her drink and got the feeling she had a hard job. He wondered what it took to please her and said that was the job he wanted. Part-time, full-time, good at it, bad at it, promoted, fired, corner office, hostile takeover, workplace accident. He said he was on his knees praying, worshiping, begging, whatever she wanted. Stacy said, okay, screw it, and they clinked glasses. Rick was in his garage when a taxi dropped off Morty and Stacy. They walked into the garage, and Morty asked if Rick was familiar with certain technology. Rick said he had great news, that he went back to the spa and purchased the containment unit from the detoxifier. Morty asked why. Toxic Rick appeared on a screen connected to the unit and said, because they were coming home. Morty asked what this was. Toxic Rick said it was the parts of Morty's grandfather that kept it real. He grabbed Toxic Morty and showed him on camera. Toxic Morty said he didn't want to be on camera because he was ugly and gross. Stacy asked if she should go. Morty said she was her own person. Stacy said, then she'd like to stay. Morty asked Rick to tell him he wasn't trying to put that stuff back inside them. Rick said the stuff was alive and belonged with them. They yanked them from their homes and locked them in a can. Toxic Rick was living in pain. Morty said that's what they do. They live in pain, they are pain, and they're all the bad parts, including dishonesty, so this could be some crazy trick. Toxic Rick said so now because he was made entirely of toxins, he was also a liar. He called Morty a little sociopath and grabbed Toxic Morty to show him. Toxic Morty said everybody hated him. Toxic Rick asked Healthy Rick if they were doing this. Rick said yes and told Morty to step into the booth. Morty refused. Toxic Rick told Healthy Rick not to negotiate and to show dominance. He told Toxic Morty to get in the booth and shoved him in, then got in himself. Rick tried to get Morty to voluntarily retoxify himself. They struggled and Morty yelled for Stacy to help and said their safe word sea cucumber. Stacy opened the door and pulled them out. A giant cloud of gas swirled around Stacy as Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty escaped and took her place. Toxic Rick said it worked, that the idiot believed every word. Healthy Rick had been right behind them the whole time. They ended up back in the containment unit with Stacy inside it instead. Toxic Rick said after 70 years of being bottled up inside a sentimental weakling, he finally got to live his own life. Healthy Rick said Toxic Rick told them they were merging. Toxic Rick said he lied, that he lies about everything, and asked why he would ever remerge with someone weak like Healthy Rick. When Rick asked if the plan was to trap them in the tank, Toxic Rick said, "Not was, still is." Toxic Rick punched Healthy Rick in the face repeatedly and kicked him. A groin defense system came out of Rick's belt buckle but refused to shoot Healthy Rick. Healthy Rick fought back and they battled throughout the house, smashing through windows and furniture. Summer was watching TV and didn't notice at first. Toxic Rick threw Healthy Rick through the glass door. Summer asked what the hell was going on. Toxic Rick told her to go away. Healthy Rick apologized. Toxic Rick activated a device that released a small blue alien creature that he made grow huge and aggressive by showing it affection. Rick pulled out a gun with an injection device and injected himself. Toxic Rick did the same. The injection made a baby version of each Rick burst out of their chests, killing them, but then rapidly growing back to normal adult age. At that moment, Toxic Morty crashed through the wall, driving Rick's spaceship with the tank attached. Morty jumped in and bit Toxic Morty's head. The ship crashed around the room. Beth walked in with groceries. Everyone stared at her. Rick asked them to leave her out of it. Toxic Rick said time for Plan B. If he couldn't trap Rick in a toxic world, he'd make the whole world toxic. He grabbed Morty, threw him out, flipped off Healthy Rick, and crashed the spaceship through the roof. Rick apologized for putting the family in danger and offered to make them dinner. Beth asked what the toxic version meant about making the world toxic. Rick said that man's motivations were a mystery. Morty told Rick they had to stop Toxic Rick and asked what the last thing Rick would think about doing with that tank was. Rick started to say it wasn't their place to pick which world got saved from what apocalypse, that their toxins had as much right to their worldview. Morty slapped Rick. Rick asked how it was healthy to slap him. Morty said obviously his version of health was very different from Rick's. Rick realized the detox machine couldn't know the difference between healthy and sick for everything that went through it. It must go by the individual's own definition of toxicity. Rick slapped Morty back and they ran off together. Toxic Rick had built a machine on a moon tower that was the perfect height and metallic composition for amplifying and beaming toxic energies. Once he flipped the switch, the entire world would be just as toxic as them. He pulled the lever, and the machine sent rays of toxic material all over Earth. At a church, a priest was praising God when the church got toxified. The priest ripped off his shirt and yelled that God was a lie they made up for money. Everyone in the church immediately started doing sexual acts with each other. On a street with food stores, teenagers ran out of a salad place into a fast food place, while a woman ran from fast food to eat out of a dumpster. At a children's birthday party with a clown mascot, the backyard got toxified. The man took off his mouse head and told the kids Santa Claus wasn't real and they were all mistakes. The kids started stabbing him with forks and knives as he bled everywhere. Toxic Rick celebrated their victory. Healthy Rick and Morty arrived with jetpacks. Rick said Toxic Rick didn't learn last time that he couldn't beat Rick. Toxic Rick asked what Rick was talking about. Rick pulled out a gun and shot Toxic Morty in the knee. He said the bullet was laced with an encrypted nanobotic virus that would disintegrate Toxic Morty in about 20 minutes. Toxic Rick said he didn't care. Rick said he knew Toxic Rick cared because Rick knew he didn't. Rick had the decryption key that neutralized the virus. If Toxic Rick wanted it, he had to merge with Rick, and he'd know how to save Toxic Morty. Toxic Rick said this was the weakest bluff ever. Rick shot Toxic Morty in the other knee. Morty said Rick, just cut the time in half to 10 minutes. Toxic Rick asked what Rick's problem was. Rick said he had all his problems removed: his entitlement, narcissism, crippling loneliness, and irrational attachments. Those things must be somewhere, but they weren't with Rick. Rick said honestly he didn't care either way, that he hated having Toxic Rick in him. And when he said honestly, Toxic Rick could believe it because they both knew Rick was too healthy to lie. Rick shot Toxic Morty a third time in the shoulder. Toxic Rick told him to knock it off and knelt down to hold Toxic Morty. He asked if Morty was okay. Toxic Morty said it hurt. Toxic Rick told him to relax and quit bitching, that he'd be fine and Grandpa was there. Healthy Rick laughed. Toxic Rick asked if Rick thought it was funny. Rick said you had to have a sense of humor about these things, but Toxic Rick couldn't because he was literally incapable of seeing the bigger picture. Rick said it was funny because Toxic Rick never did anything but complain about Rick being in charge, but if Rick ever gave Toxic Rick control, they'd be dead in 5 minutes. Rick called Toxic Rick a poor, dumb, sick animal. Toxic Rick finally gave up and said, "Just do it." Rick injected Toxic Rick in the head, then injected himself with the other end. He pressed a button that sucked Toxic Rick back into himself. Rick yelled that he was back and was the master of both worlds. He reversed the toxic beam, and everything went back to normal. Rick said it was time to remerge Morty too. Morty was flying away with his jetpack, saying Rick was a better man than him, and he was healthy enough to admit that. Rick called that kid a real piece of garbage. Toxic Morty asked if Rick was going to save him. Rick said part of him wanted to, and stuck the injection into Toxic Morty. The scene cut to Morty at a workplace in the city. He was on the phone making stock deals, using smooth talk and confidence. His coworkers cheered for him. At his apartment, Morty was cutting carrots when his phone rang. It was Jessica saying they should talk. Morty asked if that was how long it took for Rick to trace his location. Jessica said to come back, that she missed him. Morty said she missed the old him, someone who loved her so much she never had to love him back. A redhead woman came out of the kitchen. Jessica asked how Morty knew she didn't want to love him. Morty said because he wasn't sick anymore, and hung up. The woman asked if that was an ex-girlfriend and if she should be jealous. Morty said there was nothing to be jealous of. She mentioned she was scheduled to speak at a fundraiser on their date night and could cancel. Morty said they'd be together, and that was a date. She called him the perfect man, and noticed Morty didn't hang up the phone properly. Morty acted like it was an accident. 6 robot drones crashed through the window. One hovered near the woman, while others wrapped around Morty. A portal appeared on the ceiling, and Jessica and Rick fell through. Rick said it was time to take the opposite of Morty's medicine and injected him. Morty screamed in pain as his body had spasms before he finally got up. Jessica asked how Morty felt. Morty said he was miserable. Rick said he was good. Morty said it was worth it to know how much Rick cared. Jessica said she didn't care. She only did this for Rick. Rick said she kept coming to their house, asking if he got a new Morty yet. Jessica said that was because Rick kept drunk, dialing her and crying about it. Rick denied crying. Morty turned to the woman and said he wasn't who he said he was. She asked if he meant he wasn't a 14-year-old boy from the Midwest who ran away from his family and became a stockbroker by capitalizing on his lack of conscience. Morty realized he had been pretty upfront about that. She said he was upfront about everything and was her soulmate. Morty said not anymore and told her she could keep the apartment but not the robot drones because they turned into a Voltron robot and were awesome. At school, Jessica was talking to her friends in the hallway while Morty went through his locker looking sad. Rick came out of nowhere saying he needed Morty's help on an adventure, though need was a strong word since they need doorstops, but a brick would work too. Morty just said, "Okay." Rick shot a portal and walked through. Jessica called out to Morty. He stopped and looked at her with a smile. She said it was good to have him back. Rick's arm shot through the portal and grabbed Morty, pulling him in. The lesson here reveals something fundamental about human nature and self-acceptance that most people spend their entire lives struggling with. When Rick and Morty used that detoxification machine, they each got to define for themselves what counted as toxic. The machine didn't have some objective measure of good and bad. It worked based entirely on what each individual considered their own toxicity. Rick's toxic parts included his anger, his cruelty, his ego, his need to feel superior, his inability to show vulnerability. Morty's toxic parts included his insecurity, his neediness, his fear of rejection, his lack of confidence. But here's what made this episode so profound. Those so-called toxic parts weren't actually separable from who they were as people. Toxic Rick had Rick's intelligence and determination. Toxic Morty had Morty's capacity to care even when it hurt. When the healthy versions tried to function without their toxic parts, they became completely different people who weren't actually better, just different. Healthy Rick became so agreeable and apologetic that he couldn't make tough decisions. He wanted to make everyone dinner and felt accountable to his toxins to the point of paralysis. Healthy Morty became so confident and detached that he lost his ability to genuinely connect with anyone. He saw Jessica as beneath him, treated women like objects, and became a sociopathic stockbroker who capitalized on his lack of conscience. The most important moment came when Toxic Rick was trying to save Toxic Morty. Despite being made entirely of the worst parts of Rick, Toxic Rick still cared about Toxic Morty. He knelt down and held him and asked if he was okay. He told Morty that Grandpa was there. And that's when Healthy Rick realized something crucial. The attachment Rick felt to Morty, the irrational loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice for him, all of that existed in the toxic version because Rick had defined those feelings as toxic. Rick saw his love for his grandson as a weakness, as something that held him back, as a problem to be removed. But without that love, without that attachment, Healthy Rick became someone who could laugh at a dying child and feel nothing. Similarly, Morty had defined his insecurity and neediness as toxic, but those qualities were directly connected to his empathy and his ability to love Jessica genuinely. Healthy Morty didn't love anyone. He just used people. He had become exactly the kind of person who would hurt others without even noticing. The woman he was dating called him her soulmate, and he just walked away without a second thought. Jessica said she might actually want to love him, and he hung up on her. This wasn't growth or healing. This was lobotomizing the parts of yourself that make you human. The episode showed that you cannot cherry-pick which parts of yourself to keep. Your strengths and weaknesses are intertwined. Rick's intelligence came packaged with his ego and his need to prove himself. Morty's kindness came packaged with his anxiety and his fear of rejection. When you try to remove the parts you don't like, you inevitably remove parts of what makes you functional and whole. Healthy Rick couldn't protect his family because he'd removed his aggression and his willingness to do violence. Healthy Morty couldn't form real relationships because he'd removed his vulnerability and his need for connection. The solution wasn't to stay detoxified. The solution was to reintegrate and learn to manage all of those parts together. Rick forced the remerger by threatening Toxic Morty because he understood that being whole meant accepting responsibility for your worst impulses while still having access to your best ones. You don't become a better person by removing your flaws. You become a better person by acknowledging them, understanding them, and choosing how to act despite them. At the end, when Morty was back to his regular anxious self, Jessica said it was good to have him back. She didn't want perfect, confident Morty. She wanted real Morty, flaws and all. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to a lesson, Rick and Morty literally weaponized. Story control kills, meaning never Ricking Morty. Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith once got trapped on a literal story train that existed only to tell anthology stories about them. And what happened revealed one of the most important lessons about how trying to control and structure every narrative element actually destroys the authentic meaning that makes stories matter in the first place. The episode opened with a train zooming through space. A man walked into a cantina-themed car where the tickets please guy greeted him and took his ticket. The man sat down at the bar where another man called the Ramamama leader greeted him. The leader said the only reason to travel by train was to travel with weapons, and they all knew at the end of this line there was only one creature worth killing, the man in the white coat. They might as well take turns exchanging stories. The Ramamama leader told his story about Planet Ramamama, where he led a group of people from a throne in a cold lair with a pit of acid. He was ordering people to be lowered into acid when Rick Sanchez burst through the door. The leader asked who Rick was, and Rick just farted in response. When the leader asked how Rick reached his sanctum, Rick farted again. The leader said this was going in circles and ordered his guards to seize Rick. The guards charged, but Rick shot them all. He drank a potion that made him grow 3 extra arms, each with their own gun. After killing all the guards, Rick took a pill that reverted him back to normal, but gave him an extra rear end that kept making flatulent sounds. The leader said he would fight Rick, but Rick just fled. The story snapped back to the present on the train. The Ramamama leader said Rick tells a different version where the leader starts crying or something, and that's why Rick had to die, because he was a liar. He asked the man why he was going to kill Rick Sanchez. The man said he didn't know who that was, and didn't accept the weird leap in logic that everyone on a train was going to kill one guy. And even if he did, why would they take turns telling stories about it like little girls at a sleepover? The Ramamama leader said if the man was trying to be hurtful, he was doing a good job. Another alien said he would take the man's turn and started telling his story about why he was going to kill Rick Sanchez. The man left and went to another train car where a Candy Santa alien was finishing a story about how Rick Sanchez saved Space Christmas. The alien noticed the newcomer and supposed he thought he had a better story about how Rick saved Space Christmas. The man asked what was with the Rick Sanchez obsession. All the aliens laughed. An alien named Goomby said the best way to answer was with his Christmas Rick tale. In the story, Rick thanked Goomby for something and Goomby told him to go inside and have a nice time. Rick went to a door and someone inside said, "Merry Christmas." Rick said, "Merry Christmas" back to Goomby. Then there was an awkward moment where Rick clearly wasn't invited inside for Christmas. He said it was okay. He didn't have to come in. There were just a lot of people and family. Rick said he got it and wasn't mad, then left alone in the wind. The aliens all laughed at this story. The man pointed out that Rick didn't even save Christmas in that story. The aliens got offended. One told him to tell his Christmas Rick story. The man pulled out a weapon and said to step back, that if anyone started a Rick Sanchez vignette, they'd be doing it through 2 holes. He said he was just trying to figure out what was going on with this train. Another person asked if he remembered getting on it. The man said no. The first thing he remembered was the "tickets please" guy asking for tickets. Then someone asked the man why he dated Rick Sanchez. The man said what? The person said he didn't have to pretend he didn't date Rick because they all did. It was a low point in life, a rebound from an ex. The man insisted he really didn't know who they were talking about. The person started another story, but suddenly a wolf appeared and attacked. The man yelled and warned the other person. At that moment, the disguises fell away, and it was revealed the man was actually Morty, and the other person was Rick. Rick said he warned Morty not to do that. Morty said he wasn't trying to reveal himself. Rick said Morty didn't have to, because the train was obviously amplifying and linking unrelated narrative fields. Morty said Rick's name, and Rick told him if Morty found him again, he needed to identify himself. Morty said he didn't know it was Rick, and asked how Rick didn't recognize him, since Rick created the disguises. Rick said when he created things, they worked because he was talented. Morty asked why they couldn't find the engine. Rick explained it wasn't a real train, it was a story device, literally a literal literary device that was quite literally metaphorically containing them. Morty suggested it was a simulation. Rick said it was worse, an anthology. Morty asked how they hijacked it. Rick said it had been hijacked for at least 2 full minutes, and asked if Morty wasn't hearing the insane conversation. Rick told the "tickets please" guy to stop the anthology, saying if they wanted one-offs, they would do interdimensional cable, not some uptight, overwritten thing. But Rick got cut off mid-sentence. The "tickets please" guy appeared again, asking for tickets. Morty said the guy must have so many tickets at this point. Then Morty noticed the "tickets please" guy was extremely muscular and had what people called cum gutters. Rick said that was gross. Morty said that's what people called them. Rick said gross people did, and he didn't want to picture bodily fluids so watery in such volumes. Rick told the guy to stay back or Rick would kick him. The "tickets please" guy attacked them. Rick yelled he would cook and eat the ticket taker. Rick coughed and found a ticket. He commented on how good the guy was at using human shields. Rick said this was ridiculous and there was a structural breach. They were losing continuity. Rick told Morty to hold on to something and keep his head inside. They crashed through into another scene at a family's birthday party in an arcade. A mother told her son Josh to share with his sister just because it was his birthday didn't mean he could be rude. The father started having an existential crisis, asking if this was real and if life was real. The mother said she was calling the nurse because he wasn't doing this tonight. The father insisted this wasn't real life. He started demanding everyone give him their tickets and had a breakdown. An emergency continuity system deployed, and Rick and Morty found themselves in another part of the train. Rick said something could come in handy. Morty asked if they could just ride out whatever was happening. Rick said no way, he'd rather die. Train cops suddenly appeared, telling them to put their hands in the air and tee up a story about Rick Sanchez. Morty yelled that Rick was Rick. The train cops shot at them, but Rick held up a tank that caused a continuity explosion when hit. The scene then cut to a training video showing what the train cops should have done differently in that situation. An instructor explained the passengers tampered with the anthology structure, so lethal response was permitted, but not while Rick was holding that tank. After the training video, it was revealed Rick and Morty had escaped into a different part of the train through the continuity explosion. Rick explained they were in a free-for-all now. Morty noticed his injured leg had healed. They found themselves looking at a circular map of the train. Rick pointed out where the stupid vignettes were and said the engine must be in a certain location. He said he would rig them spacesuits that started failing so they could pay a heavy price for re-entering at a threshold. Morty asked if they had to leave the train. Rick said they didn't have to do anything. This was just a structural guide and they would impart their own style. Morty said he didn't like how meta this was getting. Rick told him to shut up, saying Morty was 14 and watched videos of people on YouTube reacting to YouTube, so Rick would be the judge of when they got too meta. They found a person torn in half, suspended in the air between train cars. Rick said the person was suspended in disbelief, slowly dying while living out an alternative non-diegetic reality. Morty said, "What a horrible way to die." Rick said Morty didn't know the half of it. They both laughed at the pun about the guy being torn in half. Rick said Morty was naturally funny, and this was good old-fashioned fun. They didn't need to overthink things. Then the train started rumbling. Rick said they were going into an act break. The train literally paused for a commercial break, complete with a musical number. When they came back, someone was commenting on how that was a great moment, but hardly the best time Rick and Morty were musical. Other passengers started questioning if there was something weird about the train since they'd been there a really long time and nobody took their tickets. Suddenly, they all started screaming and disappeared, leaving behind floating blood. A news report played about the horrific figure known to children as Floaty Blood Man, explaining that Galaxy's greatest scientists continued to ponder this mysterious figure. After 3 months, nobody was closer to the truth. The reporter said for cutesy name news, he was Uncle Nibbles. Characters on the train discussed Floaty Blood Man. Someone said they couldn't believe he was real. Another said he was more than real. He was their new god. They explained that followers believed the entire universe was Floaty Blood Man's nightmare, as he died in a time-dilated reality, so everything could end at any minute. But the speaker was part of the Floaty Nogism Brotherhood, who believed they were keeping Floaty Blood Man alive by redirecting their suppressed sexual energies. They were staying celibate just to keep the universe existing. Someone found this attractive and they started to have relations, but this apparently killed Floaty Blood Man and everyone started screaming. Rick and Morty kept moving through the train. Rick said they had to get to the return threshold before the ticking clock on Morty's suit got to 0. Morty asked why Rick would put a ticking clock on it. Rick said because if it was too easy to get there, they would never get there, and if Morty didn't want things to be meta, he should stop deconstructing things. They found the thematic seal and Rick said they had to disrupt it. He told Morty to tell a story unrelated to them. Morty tried to think, but Rick told him to stop thinking and just do it. Morty told a terrible story about a man named Mike Johnson who had good coffee, then answered his door to find someone who wanted cookies. Then there were scorpions outside who also wanted food. Rick told Morty to stop. Morty protested he wasn't a writer. Rick said he knew. Morty's story was supposed to be awful and stupid, but Rick failed to predict how well that would mesh with the theme. Rick thought about what kind of story they would never do. He asked Morty if he knew what the Bechdel test was. Morty didn't know. Rick explained it was a formula for measuring female agency in a story proposed by a cartoonist, asking what they were teaching Morty in school. Morty said other stuff. Rick said then Morty killed them both. Rick started explaining the test, but got cut off. He said they needed 2 women who both had names who talked to each other about something other than a man. Morty quickly improvised a story about his mom and sister. Summer asked Beth if she could try her tea. Beth said yes, and that it was so good and warm. Summer asked to talk about her special time, meaning menstruation. Beth said she had one too, and hers was heavy today. Summer's was never light. They talked about Summer being mailed to Beth by a doctor woman and how the special time was their power that made them strong like a body part. Strong against what? Scorpions. Female scorpions attacking outside. They fought the scorpions with their special time power while epic music played. Their phones rang, and it was a Supreme Court lady saying they did it. They celebrated their feminist masterpiece. Rick congratulated Morty on the great job. Rick said, "Guess who had 2 reproductive organs and all the agency? Rick and Morty." A figure appeared, and Rick identified him as Storylord, saying he should have known Storylord was behind this, and he did. Morty asked who this guy was. Rick said he was like a Matrix space character. Rick said, "Let's get this fight over with because he had things to do." Storylord said, Rick of all people knew there could be no destination without a journey. Rick said he didn't know that at all because he regularly teleported. Storylord complained that there were no rules for Rick, that Rick spiraled through the multiverse, making semi-improvised statements about how nothing mattered. Storylord said, "Must be nice." Rick said nobody was stopping Storylord. Storylord said, "Not anymore." They started fighting. Rick said they already did this beat and asked if it was a double beat, saying that's just how he adventured. Rick admitted Storylord was even more impressive than the tickets please guy with his physical fitness. Rick complimented Storylord's discipline. Rick and Morty suddenly decided they weren't fighting and surrendered. Storylord kept attacking them anyway. They got hurt. An alarm went off and Storylord told something to get back in its egg. Storylord revealed nothing out there was canon. Morty started experiencing different realities. He was a soldier being told he was exposed to a chemical altering his mind. He was told to remember the highest truth, which was that he was getting beaten up on a train. Then Morty was in another reality, where someone called Professor Sanchez said something worked, that there was 100% time dilation and total immersion. This Professor Sanchez had memories of a completely different life, where he was still a scientist, had developed interdimensional travel, had a daughter, didn't have a mustache, was kind of funny sometimes, mostly making bodily sounds. He said no more secret testing, he could help people now. Someone said he'd helped people, but Professor Sanchez said he'd hurt more. A person claiming to be Morty Smith appeared, saying they put the professor's pill in their food and it worked. Professor Sanchez told him to call the police, but said it was okay. Nothing was real, and that the person wasn't real. Everyone started screaming. Back on the train, Rick told Morty that Storylord was trying to tap into them, and they had to resist. But Morty couldn't help experiencing Storylord's attempts to mine their potential for stories. Morty saw himself graduating and heading to college. Rick cried and said he really softened up. Morty said it was a human moment. Then Abradolf Linkler appeared asking for help. Rick said Storylord was taking the good stuff and asked if any of this was canon. Storylord said it could have been. He mocked that there were things Rick held sacred after all. The train device whirred as it drained Rick and Morty. Storylord said, "Don't blame others for bad decisions." Rick told Morty to resist before Storylord burned them out, but Storylord said it was too late. He asked Rick if he didn't want to see how his story ended. Rick and Morty found themselves overwhelmed with no way out. Rick said Morty was right. Sometimes it seemed hopeless. But Rick said, remember, there's always someone there for them. Morty asked who. Rick said his best friend and personal savior, Jesus Christ. Morty was shocked because Rick didn't believe in God. Rick said, but God believed in them. Rick said he thought he was the inventor, but the greatest invention of all was the free gift of eternal life. Morty asked if Rick was messing with him. Rick said he'd done plenty of messed up stuff in his life, but it was never too late to accept Christ. Jesus was always knocking at the door. They just had to open it and let him into their hearts. Morty asked how. Rick said he was glad Morty asked. They just had to close their eyes and go to Jesus in prayer. They prayed together, thanking the Heavenly Father for sending his only son, accepting Jesus into their hearts. Storylord yelled no, that this sucked, that Rick and Morty would never do this. They asked to be filled with spirit and made born again. Storylord kept screaming no. They finished their prayer with amen. Christian cartoon characters appeared celebrating. Storylord said this wasn't the greatest story ever told. It was awful. Rick corrected him, calling it the greatest story ever told. Lightning struck Storylord. The train exploded and they escaped. Storylord ended up trapped, screaming somewhere. Rick and Morty were safe. Rick said nobody ever wanted to see that religious content. Morty asked what would happen to Storylord. Rick said he got to spend eternity in every writer's hell, the Bible. Morty said some people actually liked that stuff and it seemed kind of cynical, that he didn't like taking cheap shots. Rick said, "Cheap shots? They were literally saved by Jesus Christ." Rick asked how in any way that was offensive. Morty said this was a little confusing, but it brought them closer together, tested their demons, made them believe in themselves more than ever. Rick agreed they got all that meta-canon stuff out of the way, and now they could just be themselves. Rick said, "Let's bring this train into the station." The episode ended by revealing Rick was looking at a toy train that Morty had bought him. Morty asked what Rick thought. Rick asked where Morty got it. Morty said from the citadel of Rick's gift shop and asked if Rick really liked it. Rick said he didn't think Morty would even care. Rick said Morty did the most important thing. He bought something. Morty asked what? Rick said Morty bought something with money, and Rick loved money so much. Morty asked if Rick was being sarcastic. Rick said merchandise, that Morty's only purpose in life was to buy and consume merchandise. And Morty did it. He went into a store and bought something without asking questions or raising ethical complaints. Morty just looked straight into the bleeding jaws of capitalism and said, "Yes, please." Rick said he was so proud and only wished Morty could have bought more. Rick said he loved buying things so much. Morty asked if Rick needed to go to the hospital. Rick said he loved Morty and told him to give Grandpa a kiss, on the lips if Morty wanted, whatever he was comfortable with. Some cultures did that. Rick thanked Morty and said he loved him, that Morty was his little buddy. Rick suggested they watch some interdimensional cable. They turned on the TV, but the train suddenly derailed itself inside the toy, with blood all over the windows. Storylord and Jesus Christ were inside the toy train, with Storylord trying to escape from the Bible storyline he was trapped in. Rick yelled, asking what happened to the train Morty got him. Morty said he'd return it. Rick said, "Return it? Was Morty insane?" Rick told Morty to buy another one, to consume, that nobody was out there shopping with the virus going on. Rick demanded Morty's wallet. The lesson here cuts to the absolute core of what happens when you try to control every element of a story, when you force everything into predetermined structures, when you turn narrative into a machine designed to extract and commodify creativity. Storylord represented the ultimate expression of this. He literally built a device to trap Rick and Morty inside structured anthology stories, so he could harvest their limitless potential and break through the fifth wall. But his entire philosophy was fundamentally flawed because he believed stories could be controlled, structured, and optimized to perfection. Rick and Morty escaped Storylord's trap by doing the one thing that broke all his carefully constructed rules: plot. They invoked Jesus Christ in a completely sincere Christian conversion story. This worked not because it was brilliant or clever, but because it was so formulaic and overdone and pandering that it represented the death of creativity itself. Storylord couldn't handle it because it was the narrative equivalent of admitting defeat. It was saying that if this is what happens when you try to force stories into perfect structure, then structure itself becomes meaningless. The episode showed that every time Storylord tried to control the narrative, every time he forced Rick and Morty into predetermined story beats, something broke down. The train was supposed to be an anthology where everyone told stories about Rick Sanchez, but Rick and Morty kept disrupting it by being themselves. They didn't fit into the neat little boxes that Storylord created. When they tried to pass the Bechdel test, they created a ridiculous parody that technically met the requirements but was completely absurd. When they needed to escape, they didn't use clever plotting or character development, MTM. They just prayed to Jesus because that was the most formulaic, paint-by-numbers ending possible. The reveal at the end that the entire train was just a toy from the citadel of Rick's gift shop added another devastating layer. Everything that happened, all of Storylord's grand ambitions about breaking the fifth wall and harvesting limitless potential, it was all just merchandise. It was a product designed to be consumed. Rick's monologue about how proud he was that Morty bought something, how Morty's only purpose was to buy and consume merchandise, how Morty looked into the bleeding jaws of capitalism and said yes, this wasn't Rick being weird. This was the episode pointing out its own commodification. The story train represented everything wrong with modern storytelling when it becomes too self-aware, too structured, too controlled. Every passenger on that train was obsessed with telling stories about Rick Sanchez, but none of the stories actually meant anything. They were just going through motions, following formulas, hitting beats. The Ramamama leader told a story about fighting Rick that ended with Rick running away. That wasn't satisfying or meaningful. It was just something that happened. Goombie told a Christmas story where Rick didn't save Christmas at all. He just got excluded from a party. These weren't stories. They were story-shaped objects. Storylord himself embodied this problem. He was incredibly disciplined and physically impressive, but he had no substance. He wanted to use Rick and Morty's potential to fuel his anthology, to break through the fifth wall, but he didn't understand that potential cannot be harvested. Creativity cannot be optimized. The moment you try to control narrative completely, you kill what makes it alive. Storylord ended up trapped in the Bible, which Rick called every writer's hell, because the Bible represents the ultimate controlled narrative. Every word predetermined, every meaning fixed. No room for spontaneity or genuine creativity. The episode demonstrated that the spaces between structure, the moments when things break down and stop making sense, those are actually where meaning lives. When Rick and Morty crashed through the continuity explosion, when they found themselves in the free-for-all, when the train started malfunctioning, those were the moments when they could actually be themselves. The tight anthology structure didn't showcase their characters, it trapped them. The freedom came from breaking that structure. The meta commentary throughout showed how being too aware of storytelling mechanics actually destroys the story. Morty complained it was getting too meta. Rick said Morty watched people on YouTube reacting to YouTube, so Rick would be the judge of when things got too meta. But then they kept getting more meta anyway, acknowledging they were in act breaks, pointing out double beats, recognizing they were in a structural guide. Every time they acknowledged the structure, it felt less real and less meaningful. The most profound moment was when Professor Sanchez appeared in one of the false realities. He had created technology that gave people immersive false lives, and he had memories of being a different Rick, one who had developed interdimensional travel, had a daughter, didn't have a mustache, was kind of funny sometimes. This was Rick, describing his own actual character, but from the outside, as if it was just another constructed false reality. This suggested that even their real adventures might be just another layer of controlled narrative. But the episode argued that this doesn't matter. What matters is authentic experience within whatever framework you're in. Rick and Morty escaped not by being clever or meta, but by being so aggressively formulaic that they broke the system. They refused to play by Storylord's rules, even though they were trapped in his game. They kept being themselves, even when that meant being crude, offensive, or nonsensical. They didn't let the structure control who they were. The ending with the toy train made the ultimate point. All of this, the anthology, Storylord, the meta-commentary, the biblical escape, it was all a product. It was merchandise. The show itself was acknowledging its own commodification. Rick's speech about consumption wasn't character development, it was the writers pointing out that this episode, this show, exists to be bought and sold. And even knowing that, even being completely aware of it, you're still watching, you're still consuming, you still bought the train. Storylord got exactly what he deserved by being trapped in the Bible, because he represented the kind of storytelling that treats creativity as something that can be controlled and optimized and extracted. But stories aren't engineering problems. They're not puzzles to be solved. They're living things that require freedom and spontaneity and the willingness to fail spectacularly. When you try to remove all risk, all chaos, all possibility of failure, you don't create perfect stories. You create dead ones. The lesson was clear. Story control kills meaning. The tighter you grip, the less you hold. The more you try to force narrative into predetermined structures, the more you kill what makes it alive. Storylord had all the power, all the control, all the structure, and he ended up with nothing. Rick and Morty had chaos, vulgarity, irreverence, and terrible ideas, and they escaped because that chaos was real in a way Storylord's controlled anthology never could be. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Consequences Beat Cheap Resets, the Vat of Acid episode. Rick Sanchez once invented a device that let Morty save his place in reality and reset to that point whenever he wanted, essentially letting him live without consequences. And what happened next revealed one of the most important lessons about why consequences are actually what make life meaningful, and why trying to avoid them through shortcuts and resets ultimately destroys everything. The episode started with Rick and Morty arriving at a location for what Rick called a simple exchange. Not even really an adventure. Rick told Morty that if anything went wrong, which it wouldn't, they should jump into the same vat of acid Rick jumped into. Morty was confused, asking what vat of acid. Rick explained he had pre-scouted this location and placed a vat of fake acid among the real ones. It had air hoses and a compartment of bones at the bottom. If things went wrong, they would jump into the fake acid vat and Rick would release the bones so they'd float up and make it look like they dissolved. Morty made a face showing he thought this was a stupid idea. Rick got defensive, asking what part of a fake acid vat with built-in air supply and quick-release bones wasn't inventive enough for Morty. And when did Rick's job become pitching Morty ideas? Morty just said they should do this because he had English homework. Rick asked if Morty was still learning English, the language he spoke, asking how dumb Morty was. They went inside to do the exchange. The person they were meeting said it was an interesting choice of meeting place. Rick said Morty had notes. They tried to exchange crystals for money, but the other person revealed the crystals were fake. Rick pulled a gun, but the person had a fake arm and pulled his own gun. The person said even if they killed him, Rick was a dead man. Rick agreed they were screwed and suggested they just end it with a quick death. Morty reluctantly agreed. They both jumped into a vat of acid. The criminals watched in horror as Rick and Morty appeared to dissolve in the acid, with bones floating up afterwards. One criminal said, "What kind of psycho would do that to his own grandson?" Another said, "Rick must have taken the threat seriously." The first one said, "It just didn't make sense." Another suggested, maybe as a scientist Rick knew more about acid. Maybe it was the most painless way to go. The first criminal asked how that could have been painless, noting the pause before the bones floated up meant at least 5 seconds of unparalleled torture. He said he thought he'd seen the galaxy at its darkest, but this would take a while to feel normal. The other criminals said they were good listeners and drinks were on them if he wanted to talk it out. The criminals said what happened there and he didn't want to lose the moment. They said they would stay as long as he wanted. Time passed, and the criminal told many long, detailed stories. Eventually, he said he was ready to deal with the world and they should leave. They decided to drop their dead buddy in the acid before going. One asked if they should use a different vat, wondering if acid lost its power the more it dissolved. Another said, what was he? An acidologist. They grabbed a rat-like creature to test the acid. But the first criminal said if they were testing the acid, don't use a rat, use a ladle to grab a spoonful and put it in an analyzer. Before they could do this, Rick and Morty burst out of the vat, gasping for air. The criminals panicked. One grabbed the ladle and tested the acid, determining it was indeed very acidic. They prepared to drop the dead body in, but then noticed the bones. The bones were huge and shaped like cartoon bones. They said they were canceling their night to call a bone scientist because this didn't make sense. Rick finally had enough and burst out yelling that they should just admit it was a bad idea. The criminals were shocked. Morty asked if they could go and asked what was wrong with Rick. Morty told Rick to just admit the fake acid vat was a terrible idea. Rick asked if Morty was dying of dementia and when did Morty get so cocky. Morty said tonight, the night he saw Rick fail. Rick said Morty ruined it. It was pre-ruined. Morty asked if it was worse than when Rick was a pickle, noting that Rick wasn't there for that, but it turned out kind of cool. Maybe there was a connection. Rick asked what cool thing Morty did without Rick again, sarcastically bringing up the dragon episode. Morty cursed at Rick. Rick said Morty really got in on that pop culture reference right at the peak. Rick said Morty, trying as hard as he could to hurt Rick, proved Rick's point. Morty said Rick would let Morty know when Morty had a point. Rick called Morty a big lonely drunk who should save some zingers for his English homework. Rick said there was no such thing as a bad idea. It was about execution. Morty said no such thing as a bad idea except all of Morty's ideas. Rick said wanting a dragon wasn't an idea. Morty said he wasn't talking about that he constantly pitched Rick ideas and Rick acted like they weren't worth thinking about. Rick brought up the helicopter lawn chair that Morty just saw on TV. Morty mentioned his video game style place-saving device. Rick said, "Here we go." Morty said it was a good idea. a device that let you save your place like in a video game, but in real life, so you could try stuff and go back to your save point. Rick said he saw that on a TV show. Morty asked if Rick didn't do anything unless it was original. Rick said he didn't do time travel. Morty said it wasn't time travel, it was saving a place in time. Rick asked if this was what Morty thought Rick did, if this was where the heavy lifting happened in Morty's mind. Rick asked if Morty had any idea how much work would have to go into a machine that did this. Morty said, aha, Rick couldn't do it. Rick said he could do anything. Morty's idea just wasn't worth doing. Morty kept saying Rick couldn't do it. Rick said before it was called manipulative techniques by certain groups, it was called reverse psychology, and those groups didn't invent it. Morty kept insisting Rick couldn't do it. Rick finally yelled that there was nothing he couldn't do, that he would make this place-saving video game thing. They both yelled profanities at each other. Later at 3 a.m., Rick called Morty. Morty asked why Rick called him. Rick said Morty was right, that Rick failed and couldn't make it. Rick said he was ashamed, and maybe that's why he'd been so aggressive and unfair about rejecting Morty's ideas. Morty tried to be supportive. Rick brought up the fake acid vat again, questioning if he'd lost it or never had it. Morty said he didn't mean it that way, and they just needed better ways to communicate. Morty said he was sorry he lashed out sometimes and didn't know why. Rick said hearing Morty talk about the vat really opened his eyes, making him question what he was even doing. Morty said he didn't like hearing this talk, that Rick was a great inventor, and they just had a couple things to work on. Morty suggested starting with inventing a little honesty. Rick thanked Morty and said that sounded good. Then Rick said, or maybe he'd just kill Morty. Morty was confused. Rick revealed he did it, that he made the device. Morty was amazed and thrilled. Rick asked if Morty wanted him to explain how it worked or if Morty wanted to have fun. Morty said he wanted to have fun. Rick gave Morty the device and told him to go nuts. Morty called Rick the best grandpa ever. Rick said that's all he ever wanted to hear. At school, Morty's math teacher explained he'd been absent most of the year because he fell in love with someone at a Renaissance fair and followed them around the country. The teacher asked who wanted to do some math. Morty volunteered. The teacher called it a bold move and asked if Morty could deliver. Morty exposed himself to the class. Everyone was horrified and traumatized. Then Morty pressed the reset button and was back at the moment when the teacher asked if he could deliver. Morty realized he could do anything. He kept using the device over and over. He pulled pranks, took risks, experimented with different approaches to talking to Jessica. In one reset, he casually said hi to Jessica. She got confused because she thought he knew her name from their many interactions, but maybe she was being stupid. She reintroduced herself. Morty acted cool and said, "See you around." Jessica seemed intrigued. Morty said he thought he was going to like this thing. A musical montage played showing Morty living without consequences, doing increasingly wild and dangerous things. Eventually, Morty started a genuine relationship with Jessica. She said he seemed different, like he finally found himself. Morty agreed he had. Jessica said she liked who he found and was looking forward to seeing more. She said she'd see him tomorrow. Later, Rick asked how it was going. Morty said it was fun, real fun, that he definitely did everything he wanted. But he thought Rick invented a little lesson for him along the way. Morty said living without consequences was great, but then he started wondering what he was living for, what he was building. If he was always looking back, he was never looking ahead. Then it hit him that people are who they are because of consequences. You can't live without consequences. Rick said that was a beautiful thought, but no, there were definitely consequences. Morty asked what Rick was talking about. Rick said Morty did everything he did, and it all happened. Morty asked about the respawn button, the do-over. Rick said it wasn't a do-over. Morty just did it over and over. Morty asked what Rick did. Rick said it was more appropriate to ask what Morty did. Rick explained Morty wasn't saving his place and going back because Rick didn't respect time travel. It wasn't so much a do-over as it was isolating a moment in time, splitting Morty's probable selves, and moving Morty into a near-duplicate equally probable reality at the moment of parallel determination. Time crystals were difficult, but the only real problem was there was already a Morty in each probable dimension, so they had to solve for that. Rick revealed that every time Morty reset to smell Jessica's hair, Every time he relived a satisfying moment, that's how many Mortys he incinerated. Morty was horrified, asking how many he killed. Rick told him to count every single reset. Morty realized even those times when he did certain things. Rick said especially those times. Rick told Morty it was over, to feel this and take it in. Morty asked why Rick would do this. Rick said his hands were clean. He gave Morty a choice. Morty could listen to Rick explain in great scientific detail how it all worked, or Morty could have fun. Rick asked if Morty had fun. Morty asked if this was because of the vat. Rick said no, and it was too late for apologies. What was done, but it could end. The original split was still time-stamped, and Rick could make it so those Mortys never existed at all, making them purely theoretical. Morty asked what he should do. Rick said it was clear Morty had done enough. Morty begged Rick to tell him how to save those Mortys. Rick said Morty had to live with the consequences. Those things happened somewhere, but Morty could merge the probable realities, so only one Morty did them. Morty said just do it. Rick said he would sync things up and get Morty back to his dimension. Morty asked if Rick wasn't even his Rick. Rick said every Rick had a vat. Rick said they'd invented a little honesty today. Morty said he didn't deserve this, he was just having fun. Rick compared Morty to a serial killer and said it was time to pay the piper. A SWAT team appeared outside, calling for Morty Smith to come out with his hands up. They said they were fine with just shooting him if he wanted death by police. Morty asked what this was. Rick looked and saw a SWAT team, drug dealers, activists, various organizations, including some very serious ones. Rick commented on the variety of groups after Morty. Morty kept apologizing. Rick said he was stumped. There seemed to be no way out unless Morty used what Rick called a bad idea. Morty realized Rick meant the vat. Rick made Morty say the vat was good and kiss it. The police warned Morty not to go in the vat because it was full of acid. Beth and Jerry were there begging Morty not to do it. Someone said the vat would melt Morty completely, leaving only his bones. Morty said he was going in the vat. He jumped in and appeared to dissolve. The bones floated up. People said, what a tragedy, that he was definitely dead. Why else would the bones come up? Someone wondered if they bore responsibility for this young man melting himself in acid. They questioned if they were there for justice or something else. Someone quoted Shakespeare about mercy versus justice. Everyone agreed there was a lot to think about and people should go home and hug their loved ones. One person asked how they knew it was really acid and not just bones placed in there. Rick said if they doubted it was acid, they could test it with a ladle. The person said he brought his own ladle. He tested the acid and it burned his hand horrifically. Then the man realized he was acid-proof. He celebrated wildly, saying he was going to be rich, that everyone could look at his rear end. Rick commented that guy had other stuff going on. Rick told Morty they could go home now. Morty asked if this wasn't their reality. Rick said of course not. Did Morty think Rick would waste their actual home, teaching Morty a lesson? Rick said he was going to miss this place though because certain historical events were different and ice cream had different ingredients. Morty was shocked that the marshmallows were different because those were the best part. The episode ended, showing the acid-proof man appearing on a talk show to prove he was acid-proof. The host asked if he was sure. The man said to do it. They lifted him up to drop him in acid. He celebrated as he dropped. The host joked about what body part he'd be consuming. Then the man screamed in agony, asking someone to kill him because he clearly wasn't actually acid-proof and was being dissolved alive. The lesson in this episode cuts straight to one of the most fundamental truths about human existence, that consequences are not the enemy of a meaningful life, they are the foundation of it. When Morty got the reset device, he thought he was getting freedom. He thought being able to undo anything meant he could finally live without fear, without regret, without having to carefully consider his choices. And at first, it seemed amazing. He could try anything, say anything, do anything, and if it didn't work out, he just pressed a button and it never happened. But that's not what was actually happening. Rick's device wasn't erasing consequences, it was multiplying them and hiding them from Morty. Every time Morty reset, he wasn't undoing what he did. He was killing an alternate version of himself and jumping into a new reality where a different Morty existed. That Morty got incinerated so our Morty could take his place. The consequences didn't disappear, They just got transferred to people Morty couldn't see. Every satisfying moment he wanted to relive, every embarrassing thing he wanted to erase, every experimental approach he wanted to try, each one cost another Morty his life. Morty racked up a body count that would rival serial killers, all because he wanted to live without facing the natural results of his actions. This is the seductive lie of the reset mentality. It promises you can have experiences without costs, pleasure without pain, success without the risk of failure. But that's not how reality works. Everything you do has an impact. Every choice creates ripples. When you try to eliminate consequences through shortcuts and resets and do-overs, you don't actually eliminate them. You just hide them, or push them onto others, or store them up until they all come crashing down at once. That's exactly what happened to Morty. He lived consequence-free for what seemed like a long time, but eventually every single group he'd wronged showed up at his door simultaneously. All those consequences he thought he'd erased were still there. They were just waiting. The relationship Morty built with Jessica perfectly illustrated why consequence-free living is ultimately empty. When Jessica said he seemed different, like he'd finally found himself, she was falling for a version of Morty that didn't really exist. This Morty had tried hundreds or thousands of different approaches, resetting every time something didn't work. He'd perfected his performance through endless trial and error without risk. But Jessica wasn't falling in love with who Morty really was. She was falling in love with the polished final product of countless murdered timelines. There was no authenticity there, no vulnerability, no real person, just an optimized simulation of confidence built on an ocean of corpses. That's why Morty's realization about building something and looking ahead rang hollow. He thought he'd learned that living without consequences meant not building toward anything. But the real lesson was darker. He wasn't living at all. He was replaying the same moments over and over, optimizing them like a video game speedrun, killing infinite versions of himself to achieve the perfect playthrough. That's not personal growth or character development. That's obsessive-compulsive disorder, taken to its darkest possible extreme. The episode also showed how the desire for consequence-free living comes from legitimate frustration with life's unfairness and unpredictability. Morty was tired of stuttering through conversations with Jessica. He was tired of not knowing what to say in social situations. He was tired of being awkward and anxious. When Rick gave him a way to try things without lasting consequences, of course Morty leaped at it. Most people would. The fantasy of being able to take back our mistakes is universal. But the episode demonstrated why that fantasy is actually a nightmare in disguise. Without consequences, Morty lost his ability to learn genuine lessons. Every time he reset, the memory of what happened stayed with him, but the world forgot. So he could optimize his behavior based on information no one else had. That's not wisdom, that's cheating. Real growth comes from experiencing consequences, sitting with the discomfort of failure, and figuring out how to move forward anyway. Morty never had to do that. He just reset until he found the perfect sequence of words and actions. He became a manipulator, albeit an unintentional one, gaming the system because the system no longer held him accountable. The reveal that Rick intentionally designed it this way made the lesson even more devastating. Rick knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Morty would choose fun over understanding. He knew Morty would become a mass murderer without realizing it. He let it happen because Morty criticized the acid vat plan. This was Rick's revenge for being mocked, teaching Morty that consequences are real and cannot be avoided through clever technology. It was cruel, but it was effective. Morty learned in the most brutal way possible that trying to escape consequences only creates worse ones. The final escape, using the actual fake acid vat, completed the lesson's symmetry. The plan Morty had mocked as stupid turned out to be exactly what saved them. It wasn't elegant or high-tech. It was simple and crude, but it worked because it accepted consequences instead of trying to eliminate them. Rick and Morty jumped in the acid. They had to hold their breath underwater. They had to wait for the bones to float up. They had to sell the illusion. They experienced discomfort and risk. And that's why it succeeded where Morty's consequence-free adventure failed. The VAT plan worked within reality's constraints. The reset device tried to rewrite reality itself. The man who turned out to be acid-proof perfectly illustrated the episode's final point about consequences. He got so excited about being immune to acid that he went on television to prove it. But he wasn't actually immune. The acid from testing it hadn't hurt him yet, or he'd misinterpreted what happened. When he got dropped in a vat of acid on live television, he dissolved screaming. He faced the ultimate consequence of overconfidence based on incomplete information. He thought he'd found a shortcut to fame and fortune. Instead, he found agonizing death, just like Morty thought he'd found a shortcut to a perfect life and instead found he'd become a mass murderer. The episode argued that consequences are what make our choices meaningful. If nothing you do matters because you can always undo it, then nothing you do actually matters. The weight of decisions comes from their permanence. The value of relationships comes from their fragility. The satisfaction of achievement comes from the risk of failure. Remove consequences and you remove meaning. You're left playing in a consequence-free sandbox where nothing you build or destroy means anything because it can all be reset. That's not freedom, that's a prison disguised as a playground. Morty had to merge the timelines and accept that one version of him did all those terrible things. He had to own the consequences of his actions, even though technically different versions of him in different timelines did most of them. This was Rick forcing Morty to understand that you cannot escape responsibility through metaphysical loopholes. If you make choices that harm others, even if those others exist in parallel realities you created, you are responsible for that harm. The consequences are real, even if you personally don't experience them. The lesson was clear. Consequences beat cheap resets. Living authentically with the natural results of your choices, learning from failures, experiencing regret, and making amends, growing through discomfort, this is what creates a real life worth living. Trying to optimize your way around consequences through resets and do-overs might seem appealing, but it kills everything that makes life meaningful. You end up alone in a perfect simulation of your own design, surrounded by people who don't really know you, building nothing that lasts, becoming nothing more than an algorithm optimizing for short-term pleasure at the cost of long-term meaning. That's not living. That's dying slowly while pretending you found the cheat code. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to cope with nihilism, do the next right thing, 60 minutes. Rick Sanchez once gave his family access to cable television from every conceivable reality across infinite dimensions, and what happened revealed one of the most important lessons about how to cope with existential meaninglessness by simply doing the next right thing in front of you, even when nothing matters. The episode started with the Smith family sitting in the living room watching a reality dating show. Summer was invested in who the bachelor would choose. When he picked someone unexpected, the family reacted with various levels of engagement. Rick said if it was any consolation to Summer, none of it mattered and the entire show was stupid. Jerry challenged Rick, saying he had an idea. Rick should show them his concept of good television and they would criticize that. Rick said he thought Jerry would never ask. Rick stood up and walked to the television. He disconnected the cable box and dropped it, breaking it on the floor. Jerry protested. Morty noticed the device had crystallized material and said it conducted electrons across dimensions. Rick said that was 20% accurate as usual while working on the cable box. Rick said the important thing was he just upgraded their cable package with programming from every conceivable reality. Jerry asked if that meant they got premium channels. Rick asked how about that channel in a world where humans evolved from corn. Rick turned on the TV and it showed two corn people. One said they weren't so different, both corn of action. The other said, yeah, but one of them was dead corn and shot the first one. Summer said, boring. Rick said, Summer just spent 3 months watching a man choose a fake wife. Jerry asked if it would be better if the people were corn. Rick said Jerry didn't get it. This was infinite TV from infinite universes. Rick showed them a movie about someone eating feces, a violent antique show, and then a channel showing Jerry as a guest on a talk show. Jerry told Rick to wait and go back. Beth asked what was happening. Rick agreed, asking where this was going. Jerry said no, the other thing, go back. Rick went back and found the Jerry channel. Jerry said when Rick was right, he was right. Now Rick was hooked too. After the opening credits, the family continued watching. Rick showed them a dimension where all proper nouns began with a specific prefix. Rick said it actually got old pretty quick. Jerry asked Rick to please go back to Jerry on the talk show. Rick said infinity was a big number and he didn't remember the channel. Beth told him to go back. Rick found another Jerry channel where Jerry was in a movie. Summer said their dad was in a famous film. Jerry asked what that film was. Beth asked how this was possible. Rick explained infinite timelines meant infinite possibilities, including a timeline where Jerry was a movie star. Rick said they were getting excited about the wrong aspect of this device and showed them another channel with a show called Quick Mystery, where crimes were solved instantly because killers immediately confessed with evidence. Rick asked who wanted to watch random crazy TV shows from different dimensions and who wanted to narcissistically obsess about their alternate selves. Beth, Summer, and Jerry all said the narcissistic stuff simultaneously. Rick sighed and pulled an ocular device from his coat. He explained these scanned retinas and let them view parallel timelines through genetically matching versions of their eyes. Rick threw the device into the kitchen, telling them to go fetch. Beth, Summer, and Jerry all ran to the kitchen, fighting over who got to use it first. Rick told Morty he was proud of him. Morty said he didn't care about himself and wanted to watch crazy stuff. Rick and Morty watched interdimensional cable, including absurd commercials and shows. In the kitchen, Beth wondered if they were sure they wanted to look at their own alternate lives. Jerry said maybe they should just play a board game, but then grabbed the device. Jerry saw himself as best friends with a famous actor doing illegal substances together. Beth took the device and saw herself as a surgeon, operating on humans instead of horses. Jerry said that was great. Beth always wanted to be a real surgeon. Beth said she was a real surgeon. Jerry quickly said it was Summer's turn. Summer looked through the device and didn't see anything at first. Beth suggested selecting a different timeline, noting that if Beth and Jerry achieved their dreams, there was a chance Summer wasn't even born. Beth said that came out wrong. Summer said fine, she'd find a world where they bothered to have her. She found one where they were playing a board game. Beth and Jerry said they loved that game and it was fun for fun families. Jerry asked if he could have the goggles back. Rick and Morty continued watching strange interdimensional TV. Morty commented that TV from other dimensions had a somewhat looser feel to it. Rick said it had an almost improvisational tone. They watched bizarre commercials and show previews that made no logical sense. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Beth saw herself winning a prestigious prize. Jerry took the device and saw himself working with lions, possibly in a movie. Summer took the device and saw they weren't playing one board game, but a different one. She said sarcastically that when she existed, life got more predictable. She gave the device back to Jerry. Beth said when two people create a life together, they set aside their previous lives as individuals. Jerry said, give him a break. They weren't heroes for having unprotected relations on prom night. Beth said she got it. Now that Jerry knew he could have had it better, he resented Beth for holding him back. Jerry said now that they knew Beth thought the tables were turning, they knew Beth thought there were unturned tables. Beth asked what Jerry was talking about. Jerry said all this time Beth had been thinking, what if that person hadn't talked her out of the termination? Jerry said now Beth knew. She'd be a doctor, drinking wine alone in a house full of exotic birds. And Jerry would be on a celebrity's yacht with an actress. Summer asked if they thought about terminating the pregnancy. Beth said everyone thinks about it. Obviously, she was the version of herself that didn't do it, so Summer was welcome. Jerry said yeah, Summer was welcome. Summer thanked them sarcastically, saying it was a real treat to be raised by parents who forced themselves to be together instead of being happy. Rick walked into the kitchen asking if they had wafer cookies. He grabbed the box, ate a cookie, and started walking away. He stopped and looked back at Jerry, Summer, and Beth. Rick said, looks like they'd been checking out alternate lives and realizing they didn't have it as good. That was too bad. Rick said he and Morty were having a blast. They just discovered a show, and he didn't want to rub it in, but they clearly backed the wrong conceptual horse. Rick ate another cookie and walked away. Rick and Morty were in heaven watching their show. Beth asked what they should do now. Jerry said that show Rick mentioned sounded kind of interesting. Summer said Dad. Jerry asked what. They were having fun in there. What did they want from him? Every family on this block had to wonder if they were together by choice. Their family just had interdimensional goggles to show them for a fact that they weren't. Summer said she was leaving. Beth said Summer couldn't leave. She was 17. Summer said yeah, and she wasn't pregnant. She was going to have better judgment than they had at her age. She was going to move southwest and do something with turquoise. Summer walked away. Rick and Morty kept watching TV. Summer stormed past them. Morty noticed. They watched more bizarre interdimensional programming. Jerry commented on one preview asking if it was an actual movie. The announcer said it was written and directed by Jerry Smith. Jerry asked if he wrote and directed that, questioning if he was nuts. Summer and Morty walked in and sat down. Rick told Morty he just missed a preview for Jerry's film. Morty said it didn't matter and winked at Summer. Jerry asked if he and Beth had to split custody. Who would the kids choose? Summer said it didn't matter and winked at Morty, giving him a fist bump. Jerry said, "Oh," quietly, defeated. The TV showed breaking news about the famous actor Jerry Smith leading police on a slow-speed pursuit after an apparent breakdown. Rick went to change the channel, but Jerry told him not to even think about it. Rick asked if Jerry was kidding. It was just dumb tabloid content. Jerry snatched the remote and said it was his life and they were watching it. Beth sat on the kitchen floor wearing the ocular device, drinking. She told herself she did it. She really nailed it. She was a surgeon. Yay, she won. Jerry asked where he was going on TV. Rick asked why Jerry was asking him. Rick was sitting there trying to figure out why the cops didn't just eliminate Jerry. They had a clear shot. The doorbell rang on Beth's ocular device. Beth answered the door. It was Jerry from that dimension. Jerry said he'd been in love with Beth since high school. He hated acting, hated the substances, hated the actress. He wished Beth hadn't gotten the termination, and he'd never stopped thinking about what might have been. Beth started crying and went to the living room. She dropped the device and ran to Jerry, embracing and kissing him. Rick rolled his eyes and took the remote, asking Morty and Summer if they wanted to watch their show. Summer and Morty both said yes. The most important scene happened earlier in Summer's room. After Summer decided to leave, Morty walked in, asking if she was doing okay, saying he kind of knew how she felt. Summer said no, he didn't. He was the little brother. He wasn't the cause of their parents' misery, just a symptom of it. Morty asked if he could show her something. Summer said a drawing Morty made when he was 8 wasn't going to make her feel like less of an accident. Morty pointed out the window and said that out there was his grave. Summer asked what. Morty explained that on one of their adventures, Rick and Morty basically destroyed the whole world. So they bailed on that reality and came to this one. Because in this one, the world wasn't destroyed. And in this one, they were dead. So they came here and buried themselves and took their place. And every morning, Summer ate breakfast 20 yards away from Morty's own rotting corpse. Summer asked if Morty wasn't her brother. Morty said he was better than her brother. He was a version of her brother she could trust when he said don't run. Then Morty said the most important words of the entire episode. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV? This moment encapsulated the entire lesson about coping with nihilism. Morty didn't try to convince Summer that her life had cosmic significance. He didn't tell her she was special or meant to be here, or that everything happened for a reason. He told her the absolute opposite. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's going to die. He confronted her with the ultimate meaninglessness of existence. And then, immediately after delivering this crushing existential truth, he asked the simplest possible question. Wanna watch TV? That question contained everything. When confronted with the meaninglessness of existence, when you realize you're just one version of infinite yous across infinite dimensions, when you discover you were almost never born and your parents aren't together by destiny but by accident and biological processes, when you understand that nothing you do ultimately matters in the grand scheme of an infinite multiverse, Oxus, what do? You do the next right thing in front of you. You go watch TV with your brother. The episode showed that Beth and Jerry's relationship problems stemmed from wondering if they made the right choices. They saw infinite versions of themselves who were happier, more successful, more fulfilled. Beth was a real surgeon instead of a horse surgeon. Jerry was famous and wealthy. But here's what the goggles couldn't show them. Those alternate selves had their own problems, their own regrets, their own alternate versions they might be jealous of. The grass is always greener because there are infinite lawns to compare yours to. Summer's crisis was even more fundamental. She discovered she was unplanned, that her parents considered not having her, that in many timelines she simply didn't exist. For a teenager already struggling with identity and belonging, this was devastating. She thought if she wasn't meant to exist, she shouldn't exist here either. She should run away, start over, become someone else, somewhere else. But Morty showed her that he literally wasn't meant to exist in this dimension either. The real Morty of this dimension was dead and buried in the backyard. Morty was a replacement from another dimension, living a life that technically belonged to someone else. And yet Morty chose to keep living that life. Not because it was meaningful or destined or special, but because it was the life he had, and Summer was in it, and watching TV together was better than being alone with existential dread. This is the essence of coping with nihilism, acknowledging that nothing matters while simultaneously choosing to engage with life anyway. Not because you've found some cosmic purpose or meaning, but because small moments of connection and simple acts of care are available right now. And why not? The infinite cable played into this theme perfectly. With access to every show from every dimension, the paradox of choice should have been overwhelming. There was literally infinite entertainment available. But Rick and Morty just watched whatever seemed interesting. They didn't agonize over finding the perfect show or worry they were missing something better. They engaged with what was in front of them. When Jerry wanted to watch his alternate self's breakdown, they watched it. When Rick got bored, he changed the channel. They made simple choices in the moment, without overthinking. Beth and Jerry's reconciliation at the end came not from discovering they were meant to be together, but from hearing an alternate Jerry express what their Jerry actually felt. In a dimension where Jerry became famous and Beth became a surgeon, Jerry still wanted Beth. He still regretted the termination. He still thought about what might have been. This didn't mean Beth and Jerry were destined soulmates. It meant that across the infinite variations of themselves, the feelings were consistent enough that they could choose each other despite knowing it wasn't optimal. That's the key insight. You don't need your choices to be optimal or meaningful in a cosmic sense. You just need to make choices and live with them. Beth and Jerry could spend forever looking at alternate versions of themselves, always finding someone happier or more successful. Or they could turn off the goggles and be present with the version of themselves and each other that actually existed. Neither option was objectively better. But one of them allowed for actual living, while the other was infinite comparison and regret. Summer and Morty's fist bump in front of the TV represented their mutual understanding that they were choosing to be here together, not because they had to or because it meant something grand, but because it was the next right thing. Summer could have run away, Morty could have stayed in his original dimension or jumped to any number of other ones, but they didn't. They chose to sit on the couch with their grandpa and dad and watch ridiculous interdimensional television. This is how you cope with nihilism. You don't solve it or overcome it or find hidden meaning that makes it go away. You acknowledge it fully. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. You sit with that truth. And then you ask what's next. Come watch TV? Want to get breakfast? Should we help Dad who's clearly struggling? These small, immediate choices don't solve the existential problem. They just render it irrelevant for the moment. Because while nothing matters in the infinite cosmic sense, things matter in the immediate personal sense if you decide they do. The episode never suggested the family found deep meaning or purpose. They just found each other again, in this dimension, making the choice to be together despite knowing it wasn't predestined or optimal. That was enough. Not because it solved anything, but because it was something. And something beats nothing when nothing is the only other option. Morty's grave in the backyard remained a permanent reminder. Every morning he saw physical evidence that his existence in this dimension was contingent and replaceable. And every morning he chose to eat breakfast anyway. That's the lesson. Do the next right thing, not because it matters eternally, but because it matters now. Come watch TV. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.